Hello, my YouTube family. I know many of you tune into Crime Whispers to unwind or drift off to sleep with true crime stories echoing softly in the background. So before we begin tonight's chilling tale, I want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe now. Let's get into tonight's story. Story 1. The Seoul Subway Murder, 2014. In 2014, South Korea was shaken by a haunting and senseless crime in the heart of Seoul, a city known for its vibrant life, busy subways, and bright lights. A young woman was murdered in cold blood by a man no one expected to be capable of such violence. The killer was 29-year-old Lee Ji-han. Outwardly, he led an ordinary life, raised in a middle-class neighborhood. Lee worked as a software engineer. He was known to be quiet, reserved, and introverted. Colleagues described him as smart, but distant, someone who kept to himself, rarely engaging in small talk or forming close friendships. But behind his calm demeanor, Lee was quietly battling a storm for years. He had struggled with depression and anxiety, issues that had gone untreated as he aged. Isolation consumed him. He wore a mask of normalcy, but inside, he was falling apart, battling dark thoughts, feelings of worthlessness, and unresolved rage. In the summer of 2014, Lee experienced what would become his emotional breaking point. A brief, romantic relationship had recently ended, and while for many, this would be a painful, but manageable event, for Lee, it felt like the collapse of his entire world. The breakup plunged him deeper into isolation. He began withdrawing from friends and family, spending endless hours locked inside his apartment, stewing in anger and heartbreak to those around him. The changes were subtle, but to Lee, something had shifted. His thoughts grew darker. He began to obsess not just over the woman who left him, but over people who seemed to have the happiness he never could. His resentment festered, feeding a toxic narrative in his mind that he had been rejected by life itself. And then he fixated on her. Uni, a university student, became the unwilling focus of his obsession. She was everything he believed he was not: beautiful, successful, joyful, and surrounded by friends. She represented everything he had been denied, though they had never met. Lee convinced himself she symbolized all his pain. Over the course of several weeks, he began following her, watching her movements, lurking near her university campus, planning. And on the evening of August 13, 2014, Lee made a devastating decision. As Ko Yoon-hye left the university library and walked alone toward the subway station, Lee followed her. She was unaware, completely unaware, that someone was stalking her from the shadows near a quiet alley. He approached there, away from the crowds. He attacked. He grabbed her from behind, dragging her into the alley. She screamed, but the city's noise swallowed her cries. Then, with the knife he had brought, Lee stabbed her over and over. The violence was horrific. When it was over, he stood above her body, soaked in blood, and in that moment, he felt something chilling: satisfaction. For the first time in years, he felt powerful, but it didn't last. Sirens wailed in the distance. Fear gripped him. Lee fled into the night, disappearing into the labyrinth of Seoul's streets. Aftermath: news of Ko Yoon's murders spread like wildfire. The city was in mourning. A bright, talented, and innocent young woman had been taken from the world in the most brutal way. Someone she didn't even know. Her family, devastated and heartbroken, pleaded for justice. Surveillance cameras from around the campus and subway area caught grainy footage of a man trailing her. From that footage, authorities created a composite sketch. Witnesses came forward with vital information. The hunt for her killer was intense. And then, just 4 days later, on August 17, 2014, Lee Ji-han was arrested in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. He didn't resist. He didn't run when questioned. He confessed. "I had to do it," he said quietly. "She had everything I didn't. She was perfect. I was nothing." His words stunned investigators. There had been no motive in the traditional sense, no robbery, no prior relationship, just a man consumed by rejection, bitterness, and unaddressed mental illness. who saw a stranger and made her the scapegoat for all his pain, trial, and sentencing during the trial. Lee's defense team argued that he was suffering from severe psychological distress and long-standing depression. They painted him as a broken man who had snapped, but the prosecution disagreed. This wasn't a moment of madness, they said. It was premeditated. He had stalked her. He had planned the attack. He had brought the knife in the end. The court agreed with the prosecution. Lee Ji-hun was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Legacy and lessons for Ko Yoon-hee's loved ones. The sentence brought little comfort. Their daughter, their friend, their classmate was gone. A brilliant life, full of hope and promise, had been snuffed out. Their story left a permanent mark on Seoul citizens. Called for stronger support systems for mental health, greater protections for women walking alone, and a deeper national conversation about the dangers of untreated isolation and emotional instability. Ko Yoon-hee had been a rising star studying economics at one of Seoul's most prestigious universities. Always smiling, always kind, her death left a void not only in her family's heart, but in the community at large. And so we are left with the echo of a tragedy. Woman who never knew her killer, and a man who never learned how to face his own demons. There were no winners, only grief, silence, and a question that'll haunt many for years. How could something like this happen? Thank you for listening to tonight's story. If you're still with me, I hope you're feeling calm and safe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never forget to whisper back when the world speaks in shadows. Ko Yoon-hee was deeply loved by everyone who knew her. Friends described her as diligent, compassionate, and always able to lift the mood. With her laughter, she had a remarkable dedication to her studies and had recently secured a coveted internship at a prestigious firm. The future ahead of her shimmered with possibilities. Her parents had always been her biggest supporters. To them, she was the embodiment of perseverance and potential. They were immensely proud of the woman she was becoming. Never could they have imagined that her life would be stolen in such a senseless and violent way. As the investigation progressed, and the disturbing extent of Lee Ji-hun's obsession with Ko Yoon-hee came to light, many began to ask, how had someone like him slipped through the cracks? Lee's history of mental illness eventually became public knowledge. He had been battling depression since his teenage years, but had never sought meaningful help. Those who knew him described him as socially withdrawn, emotionally distant, and incapable of forming close bonds. Though never previously violent, he often expressed a quiet bitterness sexually about his perceived inability to connect with others, despite the public's growing awareness of his mental health issues. There was little sympathy for Lee after all. He had targeted a complete stranger, a young woman who had done nothing to him. The people of Seoul, and especially mental health advocates, were quick to point out, mental illness does not excuse murder. Depression, no matter how profound, is never a justification for taking a human life. Yes, Lee had struggled, but his obsessive behavior had moved far beyond emotional distress. It had transformed into something dangerous, delusional, and violent. Trial. The search for justice. Throughout the trial, Lee's defense team argued that he had been experiencing severe psychological distress. They brought in expert witnesses who testified that Lee had developed a delusional obsession with Ko Yoon-hee in his mind. They said she symbolized everything he believed he was denied. He saw her success and joy as personal attacks. Believing that her mere existence had somehow wronged him, they painted a portrait of a man who had lost control, overwhelmed by a toxic mix of depression, alienation, and rejection. But the prosecution told a very different story. They argued that Lee's actions weren't those of a man who snapped in a moment of madness, but of someone who had calculated and planned his attack. He had followed Ko Yoon-hee for weeks. He had chosen a secluded location. He had brought a weapon. This, the prosecution insisted, was not a crime of passion, but a premeditated act of violence born out of entitlement and delusion. As the trial wore on, the contrast between Lee's cold detachment and the vibrant life of Ko Yoon-hee became painfully clear. Friends and family testified about her ambition, her kindness, her dreams. They described a young woman who had worked hard, loved deeply, and brought joy to everyone she encountered. In a single horrific moment, it had all been taken away by a man who felt the world owed him something he had never earned. For Ko Yoon-hee's parents, each day in court was torment. They sat through the graphic details of their daughter's final moments, forced to relive the horror again and again. They couldn't comprehend how someone they had never known could cause them so much pain, yet, through that agony, they clung to one hope: justice. They knew it wouldn't bring their daughter back, but it was the only remaining path toward resolution. Verdict. Mixed reactions. Lee Ji-hoon remained expressionless. Throughout most of the proceedings he showed little emotion, no remorse, no sorrow. His answers were mechanical, as if he was completely detached from the weight of what he had done to the court and to Ko Yoon-hee's family. It seemed like he didn't fully grasp the enormity of his actions. When the final verdict was announced, life in prison without parole, reactions were mixed. Some believed the sentence was too lenient, considering the brutal nature of the crime. Others believed his mental health struggles should have been given more consideration. But for Ko Yoon-hee's parents, the ruling brought some sense of peace. They would never have their daughter back, but at least her killer would never again walk free. Aftermath. The nation reflects. The murder of Ko Yoon-hee sent shockwaves through South Korea. It was more than just a horrific crime. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of what can happen when mental illness, isolation, and unchecked obsession are left unaddressed. In the days and months following the trial, public discourse around mental health began to grow. People started asking difficult but necessary questions. How had Lee fallen so far without anyone noticing? What could have been done to prevent this? And how many others might be silently suffering, hidden in plain sight? Though Ko Yoon-hee's life had been stolen, her story became a catalyst for change. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory. Her university classmates lit candles and shared messages of remembrance. Students spoke about her kindness, her dreams, and the way she made the world a little brighter just by being in their belongings. Books, clothes, photos from her travels, bake sacred relics to her grieving family. In quiet moments, her mother would hold them and wish she could turn back time. No parent should ever have to bury their child, and yet this was now their reality, ending a call for compassion and action. Ko Yoon-hee's friends continued to mourn her absence, gathering often to remember the person who had meant so much to them. They struggled to understand how someone she had never known, someone completely disconnected from her life, could take her away so violently. As her story echoed across the nation, people began to reflect not only on the tragedy of her death, but on the systemic failures that had allowed it to happen. The stigma surrounding mental illness in South Korea remained deeply entrenched. Many who needed help were still too afraid to ask for it. While there were early signs of progress, more open conversations, mental health campaigns, and calls for reform, real, lasting change would take time. And still, at the heart of it all, was the memory of a young woman with a bright smile and an even brighter future. A woman who had done nothing wrong, who had simply existed, and for that, she had been targeted. Story 1. Ko Yoon-hee. Despite widespread calls for change, the stigma around mental illness in South Korea persisted. Many continued to suffer silently, trapped by cultural taboos that discouraged vulnerability and openness. As for Lee Ji-hoon, his life behind bars mirrored the isolation he had once chosen but now could not escape. Though he confessed to the crime, questions lingered. Was he a deeply disturbed man crushed under the weight of untreated mental illness, or a cold and calculating killer who meticulously planned the death of an innocent woman? The answer remained painfully complex. Mental health experts, legal professionals, and the public struggled to make sense of Lee's motives. In prison, he was given psychiatric care, but progress was slow. He remained withdrawn, often expressionless, disconnected from remorse, as if caught once again in the same numb detachment that had led to the crime. Some wondered if Lee could ever fully comprehend the gravity of what he had done, or if he would forever remain a prisoner of his own mind, haunted by guilt, bitterness, or perhaps nothing. Yet all his story became a stark symbol of the consequences of untreated mental illness, a cautionary tale of what can happen when pain festers unacknowledged, and resentment turns violent. Ko-On-hee's life, by contrast, was a radiant reminder of all that is possible when a person is supported, driven, and surrounded by love. Her story was no longer just about the way she died. It became a call to action, a plea for compassion, a demand for societal change. Her memory lived on in those who loved her, and in the quiet but powerful conversations she helped ignite about mental health and emotional well-being. Transition.com, but foreboding tone. But the tragedy of one innocent life stolen would not be the last. Less than a year later, across the ocean in the United States, the world would again bear witness to hatred manifesting in violence, this time not from isolation or obsession, but from a deep and deliberate ideology of white supremacy. This is the story of Dylann Roof, the massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Story 2. Charleston Church, shooting June 17, 2015. On the warm summer evening of June 17, 2015, a 21-year-old man named Dylann Roof quietly walked into the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest historically black churches in the United States. With his pale skin, bowl-cut hair, and distant, emotionless stare, he looked out of place, but no one questioned his presence for over an hour. Roof sat silently among the worshippers, who had welcomed him into their weekly Bible study session. Without hesitation they spoke of Scripture, of hope, of God's love, never suspecting that the young man sitting among them had come there with murder in his heart. At approximately 9:05 p.m., Dylann Roof stood up, pulled out a .45 caliber Glock pistol, and opened fire. Panic and terror-erupted screams filled the air as bullets tore through the sacred space. Some dove to the ground, others clung to their loved ones, but within minutes, 9 lives were taken, among them the church's beloved pastor and South Carolina State Senator, Reverend Clementa Pinckney Roof, reloaded multiple times. Calmly walking among the victims, survivors would later testify that he delivered chilling remarks during the shooting. "You're taking over our country," he said coldly, before turning his gun toward his next target. One woman survived by pretending to be dead. Another was intentionally spared so she could, as Roof put it, tell the world what happened, and then he fled after machination. In mourning, the massacre left the city of Charleston shattered. The nation was stunned, not just by the scale of the violence, but by the intent behind it. Manhunt ensued. Authorities released surveillance footage and sought public assistance. Less than 14 hours later, Dylann Roof was arrested over 240 miles away in Shelby, North Carolina, after a tip from a concerned citizen. As he sat in police custody, the true scope of his hatred came to light. Investigators uncovered photos of Roof posing with Confederate flags and Nazi symbols. They found a disturbing online manifesto in which he ranted about race, claimed white people were being systematically oppressed, and called for a race war. He had specifically chosen the Emmanuel AME Church for its historic significance, symbol of black resistance and civil rights. Roof's attack wasn't impulsive. It had been planned for months. He had scouted the church in advance, learned its schedule, and waited until the right moment when the most people would be present. Gun he used, a .45 caliber Glock, had been legally purchased, despite a prior drug conviction. A clerical error in the background check system had allowed the sale to go through. This devastating oversight sparked nationwide outrage and renewed debates about gun control and systemic failures. The victims' names that must never be forgotten. Outside the church, an impromptu memorial grew. Flowers, handwritten notes, prayers from strangers. A grieving nation came together to mourn the loss of Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Nethel Middleton, Dr. Tiwanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman, Singleton, Mira Thompson. 9 lives stolen in a moment of hatred, but never forgotten. Forgiveness, a moment that stunned the world. Just days after the massacre, something extraordinary happened at Roof's bond hearing. The families of the victims stood in court and spoke directly to him, but instead of rage, they offered forgiveness. "You took something very precious from me," said Nadine Collier, whose mother, Ethel Lance, had been killed. "But I forgive you." The moment stunned the nation. It was a profound expression of grace in the face of horror, a testament to the strength of the very community Roof had tried to destroy while the shooting was meant to incite a race war. What it sparked instead was unity ending transition to broader themes, but unity alone was not enough. The massacre reignited urgent conversations about racism, white supremacy, and gun reform. It forced a reckoning with the deep wounds of America's past and present, and with the ease with which hatred could arm itself and strike. Dylan Roof's trial would come later. He would be found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death, the first federal hate crime case to result in such a sentence yet. Long after the courtroom doors closed, the echoes of his crimes remained. The Charleston church shooting sparked a nationwide debate about racism in America, particularly surrounding the Confederate flag, which Dylan Roof had proudly posed with in photographs in the wake of the massacre. Public pressure surged to remove the Confederate battle flag from South Carolina's State House grounds for decades. Efforts to take down the flag had been blocked by lawmakers who insisted it represented heritage, not hate. But after the tragedy in Charleston, that argument no longer held. In July 10, 2015, less than a month after the shooting, the Confederate flag was finally removed in a historic moment witnessed by thousands. To some, it marked a step toward healing. To others, it was merely symbolic, failing to address the deeper, systemic racism that had contributed to the attack. Meanwhile, Dylan Roof remained in federal custody, showing no remorse. In fact, he was disturbingly unrepentant. During interrogations, investigators reported that Roof calmly confessed to the killings, stating he had no regrets and would do it again if given the chance. His chilling lack of emotion solidified the image of a man consumed by hate. Federal prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, a rare move, particularly in federal court. But given the scope and savagery of Roof's crimes, they argued, the harshest punishment was warranted. His defense team attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would spare him execution in exchange for life in prison. Roof refused in an act of arrogance or delusion. He insisted on representing himself in court. His decision set the stage for a highly unusual and emotionally charged trial. It wasn't just about determining Roof's fate, it became a national reckoning, forcing the country to confront its deep, unhealed racial wounds. As the trial neared, the emotional weight of the case was felt. Nationwide jury selection began in November 2016. Hundreds of potential jurors were screened as the court sought individuals capable of fairly weighing the evidence while enduring the emotional intensity of the testimony. On December 7, 2016, the trial officially opened. Survivors took the stand, recounting the horrors of that night at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in vivid, heartbreaking detail. One survivor, Felicia Sanders, described hiding under a table with her 11-year-old granddaughter, whispering for her to stay silent as Roof methodically executed others in the room. He was cold, calculated. He wanted to make sure there were no survivors. She testified. Roof, emotionless throughout the trial, refused to cross-examine witnesses or present a defense. In a bizarre and unsettling moment, he told the jury, "I still feel like I had to do it." The prosecution introduced damning evidence, including Roof's manifesto, in which he described his belief in white supremacy and his conviction that violence was necessary to protect it. They presented photographs of Roof posing proudly with the Confederate flag, along with search histories, proving the attack was meticulously premeditated. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Roof guilty on all 33 federal charges, including hate crimes and obstruction of religious freedom. During the sentencing phase, the families of the victims returned to the stand. They spoke not of vengeance, but of unbearable loss, the birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments they would never share again despite their pain. Many offered forgiveness, an act that stunned many observers. How could they forgive the man who had taken so much? but for those familiar with the teachings of Emmanuel AIM Church, it was an expression of faith, a belief in justice beyond the courts. The defense argued that Roof was mentally ill, radicalized by isolation and online extremism, but the jury was unmoved. Roof himself rejected any claim of psychological illness, stating, "There's nothing wrong with me psychologically." On January 10, 2017, Dylan Roof was sentenced to death, becoming the first person in U.S. history to receive the federal death penalty for a hate crime, even as the sentence was read aloud. Roof remained impassive, showing no reaction to the outcome. His conviction was widely seen as justice, but it could not undo the pain, nor bring back the lives lost. The Charleston community continued to mourn. Emmanuel AIM Church, though scarred, kept its doors open. The congregation stood firm, determined to persevere in the years that followed. The case served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked extremism. It reignited urgent conversations around gun control, white supremacist radicalization, and the deep racial divisions that still plagued America. Though the Confederate flag was taken down, many argued that such gestures were not enough, that real change required confronting the roots of hatred that allowed someone like Roof to thrive today. Dylan Roof remains on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He has exhausted multiple appeals and, barring any last-minute legal intervention, will eventually face execution. But, for many, the true measure of justice isn't found in Roof's sentence. It is seen in Charleston's resilience, in the strength of the community, in the unity of the mourners who gathered not to spread hate, but to preach love. The message from Charleston was clear: hate may take lives, but it will never defeat the human spirit. The November 13, 2015 Paris attacks, a city under siege. On the evening of November 13, 2015, Paris descended into chaos as a series of coordinated terrorist attacks struck the heart of the city. The first wave began when gunmen opened fire on the crowded terraces of Le Carillon, a popular cafe in the 10th arrondissement. Seconds later, they crossed the street and targeted Le Petit Cambodge, a nearby Cambodian restaurant. The attackers fired indiscriminately, leaving devastation in their wake. Emergency services rushed to the scene. Reports of additional shootings and explosions surfaced by 9:30 p.m. A suicide bomber had detonated near the Stade de France, just outside Paris, intensifying the panic. French President François Hollande, who was attending a soccer match inside the stadium, was swiftly evacuated in an effort to avoid widespread panic. Officials decided to allow the game to continue, though the growing tension in the crowd was unmistakable. Meanwhile, the carnage escalated at 9:32 p.m. Gunmen targeted Caf Bon Beer and La Casa Nostra, a pizzeria in the 11th arrondissement, again shooting into a crowd of unsuspecting diners. The same pattern played out at La Belle Equipe, a cafe on Rue des Charons, where gunmen opened fire with military-grade assault rifles. The attackers arrived in black vehicles, heavily armed and coldly methodical. They showed no mercy. The most horrifying scene unfolded at 9:40 p.m. At the Bataclan Theater inside, the American rock band Eagles of Death Metal was performing to a sold-out crowd of around 1,500 people. 3 terrorists stormed the venue, opening fire and taking hostages. At first, the crowd mistook the gunfire for pyrotechnics, and the bodies began to fall, and panic erupted. The gunmen, armed with AK-47s and wearing suicide vests, herded survivors to the front of the stage, using them as human shields in a prolonged and terrifying standoff with police. A third explosion rocked the Stade de France at 9:53 p.m., marking the last of the night's coordinated blasts. Simultaneous nature of the attacks made it clear that this was a highly orchestrated assault designed to maximize fear and confusion. Emergency services were stretched to their limits. Hospitals initiated mass casualty protocols, and the streets of Paris were awash in sirens, flashing lights, and chaos. Inside the Bataclan, hostages endured a nightmare. The attackers shouted extremist slogans, condemned France's military operations in Syria and Iraq, and executed captives methodically. Some concertgoers escaped through emergency exits or played dead to survive. Survivors later recounted the attackers' eerie calmness and deliberate brutality at 12:20 a.m. after hours of horror. French elite tactical units stormed the theater in the ensuing gun battle. 2 of the terrorists detonated their suicide vests, while a third was shot before he could do the same. The assault brought the siege to an end, but the toll was staggering. 90 people were killed at the Bataclan alone, making it the deadliest attack of the night in total. 130 people were killed across Paris, and more than 350 were injured, marking the deadliest act of terrorism in France since World War II. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant ISO claimed responsibility, stating the attacks were in retaliation for French airstrikes against ISIL targets in the Middle East. The attackers were soon identified as a mix of French and Belgian nationals, some of whom had traveled to Syria and returned to Europe undetected. They exploited refugee routes and the porous borders of the Schengen area, revealing troubling security gaps in the immediate aftermath. France declared a nationwide state of emergency. President Hollande called the attacks an act of war, and within hours, France launched retaliatory airstrikes on ISIL strongholds. In Syria, security forces were placed on high alert, borders were tightened, and raids were conducted to dismantle terrorist networks. The investigation progressed rapidly. Authorities identified Abdelhamid Aboud, a Belgian national and known extremist, as the mastermind of the attacks. Surveillance footage confirmed he was in Paris that night. Despite being one of Europe's most wanted men, he had slipped back into the continent undetected. His involvement raised urgent questions about the failures in intelligence sharing and cross-border surveillance. In November 18th, acting on intelligence, French police raided an apartment in the suburb of Saint-Denis. A fierce 7-hour gunfight followed. Aboud's cousin, Hasna, at Bouloxin, detonated her explosive vest, killing herself instantly. Aboud was shot and killed. His body was nearly unrecognizable due to the blast. One fugitive remains Salah Abdeslam, the only surviving attacker. Unlike the others, he had fled Paris after the massacre. He managed to evade capture for months, despite an international manhunt. In March 2016, Belgian authorities tracked him down in Brussels and arrested him in a dramatic raid. His capture provided critical insight into how the attacks were financed, planned, and coordinated. The Paris attacks forced Europe to confront a grim new reality. Terrorism had evolved. The massacre exposed serious flaws in intelligence coordination, border control, and the monitoring of radicalized individuals. It sparked renewed debate over immigration, refugee policy, and national securities. The sun rose on November 14, 2015. Paris was a city in morning. Blood still stained cafe sidewalks, shattered glass littered the streets, and bullet holes scarred the walls. The Bataclan, once a place of music and celebration, had become a symbol of tragedy. Survivors bravely shared their stories of hiding, playing dead, shielding strangers, and facing death. The world responded with an outpouring of solidarity. Global landmarks lit up in the colors of the French flag. Vigils were held across continents. The phrase Je suis Paris became a symbol of unity and resistance in the face of unspeakable violence. The people of Paris stood strong. Their resilience, their grief, and their determination to carry on became a global testament to the strength of the human spirit, and a reminder that even in darkness, light endures. The attackers behind the Paris terror attacks had been born and raised in Europe, yet they were lured into the grip of violent, jihadist ideology. Their actions reignited fierce debates across the continent about immigration, national security, and the consequences of war. Some politicians pointed to reports that at least one attacker had entered Europe with a forged Syrian passport, arguing that the refugee crisis had opened the door to terror. But others warned that such fears played directly into ISIS's strategy to exploit humanitarian movements, deepen division, and spread hatred. They reminded the public that most refugees were themselves fleeing the very terror that struck Paris beyond the politics. The psychological toll on the people of Paris was profound, known for its unshakable spirit. The city now grappled with fear and grief on an unprecedented scale. Crowded places were suddenly seen as threats. Concert halls, cafes, and sports arenas, symbols of joy in life, had become scenes of tragedy. Heavily armed soldiers patrolling the streets became a permanent, haunting fixture. But even in the face of horror, Parisians came together. Candlelight vigils illuminated city squares. Messages of love and defiance were scrawled on walls and posted online. #GSUIS Paris spread across the globe, echoing the unity shown after the Charlie Hebdo attack earlier that year. One survivor outside the Bataclan placed a sign that read, "They wanted us to be afraid. Instead, we will sing louder," and they did. Life resumed, slowly but defiantly. Theaters reopened, music returned. Paris refused to surrender to fear. The investigation into the November 13th attacks would stretch on for years, uncovering a vast web of terrorist networks spanning Europe. Dozens were arrested for providing weapons, safe houses, or travel assistance to the attackers. The attacks significantly weakened ISIS's ability to launch similar operations in the West, as counterterrorism efforts intensified. Still, for the families of the 130 victims, justice could never fill the void. Legal proceedings dragged on across both France and Belgium, but even as suspects stood trial, the pain endured. The night of November 13th became a permanent scar on the French psyche, stark reminder of the global threat of extremism, the fragility of safety, and the strength of a society that refused to break as time passed. The full impact of that night continued to unfold. France undertook sweeping changes to its security infrastructure. Intelligence operations expanded. New laws granted broader surveillance powers. President François Hollande's declaration of a national state of emergency remained in effect until 2017, during which time thousands of homes were searched and numerous arrests made. One of the most sobering revelations was how easily the attackers had crossed European borders using forged documents and false identities. Some had even been flagged by intelligence agencies but weren't monitored due to resource constraints. The failures triggered fierce criticism and calls for more robust intelligence sharing among EU member states. In response, Europe tightened its border controls and introduced enhanced screening at transport hubs. Even the Schengen Agreement, once a symbol of unity and free movement, came under scrutiny. But border control was only part of the solution. Investigators realized that many of the attackers had not been foreign infiltrators, but radicalized citizens from within Europe. Areas marked by unemployment, isolation, and social marginalizations, such as certain neighborhoods in Brussels and Paris, were identified as key breeding grounds for extremism. In response, governments launched de-radicalization efforts, partnering with community leaders, religious figures, and educators in hopes of preventing future tragedies. Yet another battleground emerged behind prison walls. French prisons, overcrowded and under-resourced, became incubators of radical ideology. Extremist inmates were often housed together, allowing them to recruit others. Reforms were introduced to isolate higher-risk individuals, but concerns persisted about what might happen once they were released. Turning point in the investigation came with the capture of Salah Abdeslam, the only surviving member of the attack team, who was arrested in Belgium in March 2016. He was extradited to France and brought to trial, but he refused to cooperate and expressed little remorse. The lengthy court proceedings were followed closely by grieving families, many of whom sought not just justice, but answers. In 2022, Abdeslam was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, one of the harshest penalties ever handed down in modern French history. Still, no sentence could truly ease the pain. Survivors were left with deep psychological wounds. Many battled post-traumatic stress, struggling to reclaim a sense of safety in daily life. Armed patrols around schools, train stations, and tourist sites became a normal part of the urban landscape, visible reminders of a lingering threat. Even as fear lingered, Parisians rebuilt. Memorials were installed at each attack site outside the Bataclan. A plaque honors the memory of the lives lost every year. On the anniversary of the attacks, moments of silence are observed across France, and the names of the victims are read aloud in solemn remembrance politically. The attacks marked a seismic shift. Nationalist and anti-immigration rhetoric gained momentum. Far-right politicians seized the moment to push for tighter borders, and harsher policies targeting radical Islam. Debates about religion, integration, and secularism grew sharper. But even as political divisions deepened, France reaffirmed its foundational values: liberty, equality, fraternity. In the years since, efforts to foster inclusion, interfaith dialogue, and community engagement have grown. France knows that the battle against extremism isn't just fought on borders, it's fought in minds, neighborhoods, schools, and hearts. The night of November 13th, 2015 will never be forgotten. It was the night Paris, the city of lights, was darkened, but never extinguished in the wake of the Paris attacks. Global efforts intensified to bridge divides and combat the root causes of radicalization. Community engagement initiatives were launched worldwide, aiming to foster dialogue, promote inclusivity, and prevent extremist ideologies from taking hold, especially among vulnerable youth. The November 13, 2015 attacks underscored the alarming reach of ISIS and its ability to inspire violence far beyond the borders of the Middle East. In response, France dramatically escalated its military campaign against the group, joining the broader US-led coalition in launching airstrikes on ISIS strongholds in Syria and Iraq. These military efforts, combined with ground offensives by local forces, ultimately led to the collapse of ISIS's so-called caliphate in 2019. But even as ISIS lost territory, the ideology that fueled such acts of terror endured. Intelligence agencies warned of a shifting threat, one where large-scale coordinated attacks gave way to smaller, unpredictable lone wolf incidents inspired by online propaganda. The rise of social media as a recruitment tool presented new challenges for global security, requiring governments and tech companies to rethink their strategies in curbing online extremism. Looking back, the events of that dark November night in Paris became a defining moment in the fight against terrorism, a reminder of the vulnerabilities in open societies, but also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The attackers had intended to divide and paralyze with fear, but instead, they galvanized France's determination to uphold its democratic values and stand united against hate. Today, Paris continues to thrive. The memory of that night lives on, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a tribute to the strength, courage, and unbreakable spirit of a city that refused to be broken. The victims are remembered not only in memorials, but in the everyday acts of freedom carried on by those who refuse to let terror define their future. Story 4. The murder of Anthony Kevin Morin. The early hours of September 4, 2015, a brutal and calculated crime unfolded in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. At the center of this case was Dr. Kuneskeren Sitampalima, military pathologist with deep ties to Malaysia's legal and medical communities, respected in public. He was responsible for conducting government autopsies and handling high-profile forensic cases, but behind the scenes, Dr. Kuneskeren was entangled in a web of corruption, malpractice, and unethical dealings. The man leading the investigation against him was Deputy Public Prosecutor Anthony Kevin Morin, a fearless and incorruptible figure known for taking on powerful institutions and exposing entrenched corruption. Over the course of his career, Morin had become a symbol of justice in Malaysia, working closely with the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, MACC, on cases that threatened the status quo. But his latest case, one that implicated Dr. Kuneskeren, threatened to expose not only medical fraud, but systemic corruption at the intersection of the judiciary and law enforcement. Tensions between the two men had been building for months. Dr. Kuneskeren, facing the collapse of his career, reputation, and freedom, made a chilling decision. Anthony Kevin Morin had to be silenced permanently. In the morning of September 4, 2015, Murray left his home in his government-issued Proton Perdana and headed toward his office in Putrajaya. What he didn't know was that a convoy of vehicles had been dispatched to tail him, occupied by individuals hired by Dr. Kunasegaran, with a single mission to make Murray disappear. Murray reached a quieter stretch of road. A vehicle rammed into his car, forcing him to stop within seconds. His assailants descended outnumbered and ambushed. Murray was dragged from his vehicle and forced into another car. He resisted, but the attackers quickly overpowered him for days. His disappearance stunned the nation. Friends, colleagues, and family waited in anguish as investigators retraced his steps and reviewed surveillance footage. It soon became evident that this was no random abduction. It was a targeted hit. As the investigation gained momentum, authorities uncovered a sinister network of hired killers connected to Dr. Kunasegaran. One by one, the men were tracked down and arrested under pressure. They began to confess, revealing the disturbing details of Murray's final hours. According to their accounts, Murray was taken to a remote site where he was brutally murdered. His body was placed into a steel drum, which was then filled with concrete. In an effort to destroy all evidence of the crime, the drum was subsequently dumped into a swamp, as if to erase every trace of the man who had dared to speak truth to power. But justice would not be buried. One of the suspects eventually led investigators to a desolate area in Sabang Jaya, just outside Kuala Lumpur. There, partially submerged in murky waters, they discovered the cement-filled drum. It took hours of painstaking effort from forensic teams to extract and identify the remains. The truth was devastating. Anthony Kevin Murray had been killed in cold blood by those desperate to protect their criminal empire. The arrest of Dr. Kunasegaran sent shockwaves through the nation. A respected medical professional, someone entrusted with the dead, had orchestrated the murder of a prosecutor dedicated to justice. As the case proceeded to trial, the nation watched in disbelief as layer after layer of corruption, deceit, and conspiracy unraveled before the courts. Dr. Kunasegaran was ultimately charged with murder, alongside 6 other men who had carried out the killing. The legal battle that followed became a landmark case in Malaysia, a chilling example of how far those in power might go to silence dissent and how dangerous it can be to confront corruption head-on, despite the horror of the crime. Murray's legacy endured. His death became a rallying cry for reform and accountability, a stark reminder that justice sometimes comes at the highest cost. The man who had once exposed others now symbolized the very struggle he had fought for: truth, integrity, and the rule of law. His memory lives on, not just in courtrooms or headlines, but in the renewed commitment of those who carry his torch, refusing to let fear or intimidation deter them from doing what is right. The condition of the remains made identification difficult. Kevin Murray's body, encased in cement and hidden away for days, bore the marks of a deliberate effort to erase all trace of his existence. But forensic specialists were relentless. They extracted DNA from the deteriorating tissue, and after exhaustive testing, confirmed what the nation had feared. The body was indeed that of Kevin Murray. Discovery sent shockwaves across Malaysia. Kevin's murder was not just a devastating loss for his family, it was a national tragedy. A man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law had been silenced for doing exactly that. His death laid bare the grave risks faced by those who dared to confront corruption at the highest levels. With his remains recovered, attention quickly turned to the people responsible. One by one, the hired killers confessed. Their testimonies revealed a chilling level of coordination and intent. The murder had been planned weeks in advance, meticulously orchestrated by none other than Dr. Kunan. Sivaswarender Kunan had once been a respected figure in both the medical and legal communities, a man who walked the corridors of influence with ease. But beneath that polished image was someone desperate. Cornered by a corruption case Kevin Murray was actively prosecuting. The charges against Kunan were damning: falsified medical documents, bribery, and gross abuse of power. If convicted, he faced not only disgrace in prison, but the loss of his career and identity for months. Dr. Coonan tried to manipulate the system. He leveraged his connections, delayed proceedings, and attempted to suppress evidence, but Kevin Morey was undeterred, known for his integrity and fearlessness. He refused to bow to intimidation or bribery. His resolve made him a threat in Coonan's eyes. A target investigators uncovered a chilling web of complicity. Dr. Coonan had recruited multiple individuals, each assigned a specific role. Some monitored Kevin's movements, documenting his daily routine. Others planned and executed the ambush on the day of the abduction. They intercepted Kevin on the road, forcibly removing him from his vehicle. He was taken to an undisclosed location, where he was tortured before being killed. His body was then placed inside a steel drum, which was filled with cement to destroy any chance of identification, but in their haste, the perpetrators made critical mistakes. Surveillance footage captured Kevin's car being tailed by multiple vehicles the morning he vanished. Witnesses later reported seeing a struggle near where his abandoned vehicle was found. Cell phone records revealed a pattern of communication between Dr. Coonan and the assassins before and after the murder. The trail of evidence was damning, and it would soon be laid bare in court as news of the investigation spread. Public outrage swelled Kevin Morey. Murder became more than just a crime. It was an attack on justice itself. Malaysia, already grappling with widespread corruption, now faced a hard truth. The forces of impunity were willing to kill to protect themselves. Vigils were held across the country. Thousands gathered to honor Kevin's memory. His colleagues spoke of his unwavering ethics, his relentless work ethic, and the courage he brought to even the most dangerous cases. His family, shattered by the loss, demanded justice not only for Kevin, but for every whistleblower and prosecutor who had been threatened, silenced, or ignored behind bars. Dr. Coonan began to understand the gravity of what he had done. The arrogance that had once convinced him he could outmaneuver the law now gave way to quiet desperation. The legal system he had tried to manipulate was closing in, and this time, he would be the one on trial. The prosecution assembled a formidable case. Their goal was not just to convict the hitman, it was to expose the man who had masterminded it all. The trial, set to begin in late 2016, quickly became one of the most anticipated in Malaysia's history. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, legal analysts, and concerned citizens. It was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a national reckoning. Leading the prosecution was one of Kevin Morey's former colleagues. Now determined to see justice served, the team laid out every details, footage, phone logs, and the confessions of the assassins, all forming a chilling narrative of cold-blooded murder, driven by fear and self-preservation. Defense attempted to counter by portraying Dr. Coonan as a man pushed to the edge. Acting out of desperation, they argued he had been framed, that the confessions were coerced, that the evidence was circumstantial, but their narrative failed to sway public sentiment. To many, the evidence was too strong and the pain too raw. As the trial unfolded, the court heard from key witnesses, investigators, forensic experts, and legal professionals who had worked alongside Kevin. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when Kevin's brother, Richard Morey, took the stand. He described the agony of losing his older brother, the man who had always stood up for what was right even when it cost him everything. Richard's testimony humanized the case, reminding everyone that behind the headlines and legal jargon was a family devastated beyond words. Throughout the proceedings, Dr. Coonan remained stoic. He barely reacted, as though clinging to a crumbling facade of control. But those who knew him well noticed the cracks, moments where fear flickered across his eyes, where his silence betrayed the weight of his guilt after months of emotional testimony and airtight legal arguments. The trial neared its end. The defense made its final plea, arguing for mercy, doubt, and reasonable suspicion, but the evidence spoke louder, and so did the people of Malaysia. Once again, the defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, but the damage had already been done. The evidence was overwhelming, the facts irrefutable. After several days of intense deliberation, the jury reached a verdict on February 22, 2017, in a packed Malaysian courtroom. The judgment was read aloud. Dr. Kessens, Ves Warren, was found guilty of orchestrating the murder of prosecutor Kevin Moore. Alongside him, several accomplices including the hired killers responsible for Kevin's abduction and execution were also convicted. Dr. Kessen was sentenced to death by hanging, while the others received varying prison terms based on their roles in the crime. The verdict sent shockwaves through both the legal and medical communities. It was virtually unprecedented for someone of Dr. Kessen's stature, a respected figure in Malaysia's elite medical and academic circles, to not only be convicted of such a brutal act, but to also receive the death penalty for many. The conviction was a powerful symbol that no one, not even the influential or well-connected, was above the law, but the verdict also ignited a broader national reckoning. Dr. Kessen's arrest and conviction sparked fierce debate about the deeply rooted corruption in Malaysia's political and institutional systems. His case exposed the chilling reality. Even the most trusted and educated members of society could harbor deadly secrets and use their influence to silence those who stood in their way. For many, Kevin Moore's murder became a grim wake-up call. It was a tragic reminder that the fight for justice and transparency came with dangerous consequences, that seeking truth could in fact cost your life. Yet amid the sorrow, it was also a turning point. Kevin Moore's death galvanized a national conversation about transparency, accountability, and the urgent need to protect whistleblowers and reform broken systems. In the years following the trial, Malaysia began to implement sweeping anti-corruption reforms, new policies, improved safeguards, and a more empowered civil society took root. Emboldened by the sacrifice of one man who refused to back down to Kevin's family, friends, and colleagues, he was more than just a prosecutor. He was a man of unshakable integrity. Someone who stood for what was right no matter the risk. Though his life was cut short, his legacy endured. His courage became the foundation for a more just and transparent Malaysia story. 5 in 2015. A deeply disturbing crime unfolded in the bustling city of Fuzhou, Fujian province, China. At the center was a 22-year-old university student named Wu. Born on November 6, 1992, Wu came from a middle-class family and was studying at Peking University, one of China's most prestigious academic institutions. To outsiders, he appeared to be a model student with a bright future, but beneath his polished exterior was a growing darkness fueled by long-standing resentment. Wu's relationship with his mother, Sing Tianqin, had always been tense. She was a determined woman who had worked tirelessly to provide her son with every possible opportunity. Her life revolved around his success, and she spared no effort in making sure he remained at the top of his class. But what she saw as devotion, Wu came to see as domination. He felt suffocated by her relentless expectations and controlling presence. Despite his academic achievements, Wu believed he could never meet her impossibly high standards. That emotional weight slowly twisted into something more sinister in his mind. His mother wasn't just demanding, she was a barrier to his freedom, and so he began to fantasize about the unthinkable. If she were gone, he could finally be free. This wasn't a crime of passion. Wu's plan was coldly calculated over the course of several months. He meticulously laid the groundwork. He waited for the right moment. On July 10, 2015, he invited his mother to his residence in Fuzhou, under the guise of discussing his future, always eager to support her son's ambitions. Sang Tianqin accepted. She had no idea it would be the last day of her life as she settled in. Wu feigned sincerity, speaking calmly about his academic plans, carefully lulling her into a false sense of trust. Then, without warning, he struck using a dumbbell bar. He repeatedly hit his mother, delivering fatal blows in a brutal, premeditated attack. After the murder, Wu displayed chilling emotional detachment. He wrapped her body in layers of plastic and activated carbon to suppress the odor of decomposition. Hiding it in his dormitory room, he then began spinning an elaborate web of lies. He told family members that his mother had accompanied him abroad for further studies. He faked emails and phone calls, posing as her to keep suspicions at bay. Wu used her money to fund a lavish lifestyle free at last, he believed, from the scrutiny that had haunted him his entire life. But the deception couldn't last. Months passed, and Zheng Tianqin's relatives became increasingly suspicious. They hadn't heard her voice, hadn't seen her in person. Police were eventually notified, and investigation followed, and it didn't take long for Wu's carefully constructed lies to unravel. The truth was horrifying. Brilliant young student had coldly murdered his own mother in pursuit of freedom from control. What had started as a missing persons case evolved into one of China's most chilling domestic crimes. In recent memory, the revelation shocked the nation. People struggled to reconcile Wu's promising public image with the monster he had become in private. Wu's trial and convictions sparked widespread discussions in China about family pressures, the extreme demands placed on children by authoritarian parenting styles, and the psychological toll they can take. But no amount of discussion could undo the horror of what he had done. Zheng Tianqin had dedicated her life to her son's future. In return, she was met with betrayal of the worst kind. Her murder stands as a haunting reminder of what can happen when resentment, pressure, and emotional dysfunction spiral out of control, unchecked, unaddressed, and finally unleashed. The investigation into Zheng Qin's disappearance took a dramatic turn when her relatives began to question the story. Wu had told them that she had gone abroad. His version of events quickly unraveled. The more they probed, the more inconsistencies they found. Despite his desperate attempts to maintain the lie, his fabrications couldn't withstand scrutiny. Wu had tried to keep up appearances. He sent emails and made phone calls impersonating his mother. He even used her social media accounts to post fabricated updates, hoping to keep friends and family at bay. But those closest to Zheng Qin knew something wasn't right. Feeling increasingly uneasy, her extended family decided to take action in February 2016. After repeated failed attempts to reach her, they reported her missing to the police. Authorities treated the report seriously and launched a formal investigation. Wu, sensing that his secret was on the verge of exposure, continued to feign ignorance, but investigators soon began to dig deeper. With his financial records, what they found raised immediate red flags. Despite being a student with no steady income, Wu had been withdrawing large sums of money from his mother's bank account since her supposed departure. He was living well beyond his means, buying luxury items and spending lavishly. It was clear something was deeply wrong. The probe widened to include interviews with Wu's peers. Some classmates recalled that he had become increasingly distant, while others noted how eerily calm he was about his mother's absence. The strange behavior only deepened suspicion. Zeroed in on Wu as their prime suspect. Finally, they obtained a warrant to search his university residence, and what they found was horrifying. Inside Wu's dorm room, authorities discovered the decomposing body of Zheng Qin. Her remains had been wrapped in layers of plastic and other materials to mask the odor of death. It was a grotesque and chilling scene that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. A forensic examination confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma, consistent with the use of a heavy object, likely a dumbbell. The evidence was undeniable. Wu had murdered his own mother in cold blood, and had then gone to great lengths to cover it up. He was arrested on April 20, 2019, at Chongqing Jiangbei International Airport. While attempting to flee the country, his plan to escape justice was thwarted just in time. Under intense interrogation, Wu eventually confessed. He admitted to killing his mother out of long-standing frustration and resentment. The details of his confession were disturbing. He described how, after the murder, he carefully concealed her body and forged digital communications to keep the illusion alive. He even used her identity to withdraw money and scam relatives out of additional funds. His motive: Wu claimed he felt suffocated by his mother's constant pressure and unrealistic expectations in his mind. Her death was the only way to escape the life she had forced upon him. He wanted freedom on his terms. That story gripped the nation. Here was a young man, well-educated, bright, and seemingly full of promise, who had committed one of the most brutal crimes imaginable. The case stirred widespread debate about the immense pressures placed on children by overbearing parents, and the mental health consequences of such expectations. When his trial began in 2020, media coverage was intense. Wu's defense team argued he was mentally unstable at the time of the murder, driven to the edge by years of emotional torment. But the prosecution portrayed a very different image, a calculating young man who had harbored deep-seated resentment and meticulously plotted his mother's murdering the courtroom. Emotions ran high. The prosecution laid out a case that showed premeditation, deception, and a total lack of remorse. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was cold, deliberate murder. Ultimately, Wu was convicted of murder and fraud. He received the death penalty for the killing of his mother and an additional 18-year prison sentence for the financial crimes committed afterward. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some felt justice had been served, while others believed a life sentence would have been more appropriate, given his age and the possibility of rehabilitation, regardless of public opinion. The case left a lasting mark. It sparked nationwide conversations about family dynamics, toxic parental expectations, and the psychological toll they can take as the story faded from the headlines. The tragedy of Seng Chin's murder remained a haunting reminder of what can happen when resentment, pressure, and emotional isolation are left to fester. Wu's name became synonymous with the darkest consequences of familial dysfunction, a cautionary tale of ambition, control, and ultimately, betrayal. Story 5. The Tragedy of Wu, a Brilliant Mind, a Broken Spirit. The defense attempted to cast Wu as a young man driven to the edge by years of emotional turmoil and psychological distress. They argued that the crushing weight of his mother's relentless expectations had gradually eroded his mental stability, pushing him toward a devastating emotional breakdown that culminated in murder. While acknowledging the severity of the crime, the defense pleaded for leniency. They asked the court to consider Wu's youth and his potential for rehabilitation, insisting that the death penalty was too severe a punishment for someone still in the early stages of adulthood. But the court was unconvinced despite the defense's emotional appeals. Wu was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of his mother and received an additional 18 years in prison for a series of fraud charges connected to the deception and financial manipulation he carried out in the aftermath of her death. The verdict sent a clear and powerful message. No matter how intelligent, academically gifted, or outwardly successful a person may appear, no one is above the law or exempt from the consequences of their actions. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed the sentence as a just outcome for an unforgivable crime, while others wrestled with the morality of executing someone so young, especially when psychological distress may have played a significant role. But as the evidence revealed during trial made clear, Wu's actions were anything but impulsive. The murder had been meticulously planned, carried out with chilling precision, and followed by an elaborate web of lies designed to conceal the truth. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was the end result of long-festering resentment, emotional suppression, and deep-seated psychological wounds. After his conviction, Wu was transferred to a prison in Fujian province to await the final decision on his appeal over the next several years. He and his legal team fought to reduce his sentence, arguing that he was not fully aware of his actions at the time of the murder due to his fragile mental state. But in May 2023, the Fujian Provincial High People's Court rejected his appeal. The court reaffirmed that Wu's actions had been premeditated and carried out with full awareness of their consequences. The death sentence was upheld. Wu had exhausted all legal options. His fate was sealed in January 31, 2024. Wu was executed by lethal injection. His death closed the final chapter in one of the most haunting criminal cases in recent memory. In the aftermath, Wu's story dominated public discourse in China. Media outlets, psychologists, educators, and parents engaged in deep conversations about the country's intense academic culture, the crushing burden of parental expectations, and the silent emotional battles many young people face, Wu's case became a tragic, cautionary tale. It sparked national debates about parenting styles, mental health, and the risks of emotional neglect. Experts warned that overbearing and perfectionistic parenting, combined with extreme academic competition, was placing enormous emotional strain on an entire generation. Wu had once been a symbol of success, a brilliant student with a promising future, but beneath the surface, he was suffering in silence, emotionally isolated and psychologically free. Wu's extended family. The tragedy was doubly painful. His mother's relatives had initially believed the lies he told, convinced she was simply away learning the truth that she had been murdered by her own son, left them devastated and betrayed. Public perception of Wu shifted dramatically once admired. He became a stark symbol of how unchecked resentment and hidden emotional struggles can manifest into unimaginable violence. His story served as a painful reminder. Success on the outside can mask deep emotional suffering on the inside. The case also reignited the national debate over capital punishment. Some saw Wu's execution as necessary justice. Others questioned whether a young man in emotional crisis should have been given the opportunity for rehabilitation rather than death. In the end, Wu's execution marked the conclusion of a case that shook China and left an indelible mark on public consciousness. Chilling reminder of what can happen when psychological wounds go unaddressed, when communication within families breaks down, and when the pursuit of perfection replaces compassion. Story 6. The Tara Edwards murder. A family shattered. In 2015, the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, became the setting for one of the most heartbreaking crimes of the year. It was a case that stunned the public and tore a family apart, a tragedy that no one saw coming. The man at the center of it all was 38-year-old Christopher Michael Edwards, known in his community as a quiet, introverted man. Christopher worked as a truck driver and lived a seemingly uneventful life to outsiders. He was reserved and unassuming, someone who kept to himself and avoided attention. But behind the walls of his suburban home, Christopher Edwards was unraveling. His marriage to 33-year-old Tara Edwards had been troubled for years. Although their relationship had started with promise, it quickly turned volatile. Tara, the mother of 2 young children, often felt overwhelmed by the pressures of home life. Christopher, meanwhile, had become increasingly unstable, his mental and emotional state deteriorating with each passing year. Their relationship was plagued by frequent arguments, financial difficulties, and emotional isolation. Tara confided in friends and family that she felt trapped, she no longer felt safe or loved, and she desperately wanted out. But Christopher's controlling behavior made it nearly impossible for her to leave. He grew more possessive, more paranoid, convinced that Tara was unfaithful, that she was planning to abandon him. Then, on the night of November 26, 2015, everything reached a tragic breaking point. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Christopher snapped. Exactly what happened inside their home that night remains unclear, but what is known is horrifying. In a brutal and frenzied attack, Christopher struck Tara multiple times with a blunt object. Then, he strangled her to death. After the murder, he attempted to cover his tracks, disposing of Tara's body in a nearby creek, hoping to hide what he had done. But the truth could not stay buried for long. When Tara failed to show up to a family event, loved ones grew worried. Police were called within days. The grim discovery of Tara's body confirmed everyone's worst fears. Christopher Edwards was arrested and charged with her murder. The case devastated the Melbourne community. Friends, neighbors, and relatives were left reeling. How could a man who had seemed so ordinary, so quiet, commit such a horrifying crime? In court, prosecutors painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy, rage, and emotional instability. A man who viewed his wife not as a partner, but as a possession he feared. Losing Tara Edwards became another name on a tragic list of women who lost their lives to domestic violence. Her death sparked renewed calls for better protections for women, stronger support systems, and earlier intervention in toxic, abusive relationships. Christopher Edwards' actions destroyed not just a life, but a family leaving to children without a mother, and a community forever haunted by the question, could this tragedy have been prevented? The murder of Tara Edwards, a story of deception, rage, and domestic tragedy. Christopher Edwards believed that by disposing of Tara's remains, he could erase all traces of his crime and escape accountability, but in his frantic effort to avoid arrest, he made critical mistakes in the hours following the murder. Edwards called several friends, telling them he'd had an argument with Tara earlier that evening. One of those friends became concerned when Tara seemingly vanished in the days that followed, trying to maintain a facade of innocence. Edwards played the role of a worried husband. He went about his daily routines, chatting with neighbors, going to work as if nothing had happened all the while. The truth lay buried beneath layers of lies. Investigation into Tara's disappearance began a few days after she was last seen initially. Police had little evidence to suggest foul play. Christopher painted a picture of a troubled but ordinary marriage, which only muddied the waters, but Tara's friends and family were unconvinced they knew her well. She wouldn't simply walk away, especially not with two young children depending on her. Their growing concern pushed investigators to take a deeper look. Key pieces of evidence began to emerge. Friends reported to police that Edwards had seemed oddly calm and emotionally detached when discussing Tara's absence. His demeanor didn't reflect that of a grieving husband. It was cold, rehearsed, and inconsistent. Detectives soon turned their attention to his phone records and uncovered a troubling detail. Edwards had made several calls to Tara's phone after she was already presumed dead. These calls weren't attempts to reach her, were calculated acts, meant to build the illusion that she had simply left and was still alive. As suspicion grew, authorities dug deeper into his financial activity. What they discovered was disturbing. Edwards had conducted a series of suspicious transactions, withdrawing large sums of money and using Tara's bank cards in ways that pointed to a cover-up and a fabricated alibi, despite mounting evidence. Edwards continued to deny any involvement, but investigators pressed forward, gathering forensic evidence that would ultimately tie him to the scene. Blood traces belonging to Tara were found in multiple parts of the house. The pattern and amount suggested she had been violently attacked and likely killed at home eventually. Edwards could no longer maintain his lies under pressure. He confessed. He told police that during an intense argument over their collapsing marriage, he had snapped, consumed by jealousy and rage. He killed Tara in what he claimed was a moment of blind fury. Tara Edwards' death left a deep scar on her community, a beloved mother, daughter, and friend. Her life was stolen in an act of senseless violence in the days after her murder. Grief rippled through Melbourne. Vigils were held, flowers left at her home, and tributes shared online. The woman remembered for her warmth and devotion was gone far too soon. The arrest of Christopher Edwards shocked everyone who knew him. He had always seemed like a man quietly struggling with the pressures of family life. No one imagined he was capable of such brutality, but behind closed doors, a much darker reality had been unfolding for years. As his trial began, a new picture of Edwards emerged, one not of a heartbroken husband, but of a man whose unresolved anger and emotional volatility had turned deadly. The children he left behind were now without a mother and facing the harrowing truth of who their father really was. The case quickly gained national attention, sparking important discussions around domestic violence, emotional abuse, and the dangers that can remain hidden behind closed doors. Tara's story became a somber warning. Abuse doesn't always come with bruises, and the signs: detachment, manipulation, financial control can often go unnoticed until it's too late. One of the turning points in the investigation came from interviews with Edwards. Close circle friends and neighbors described his demeanor after Tara's disappearance as unsettling. He was too composed, eerily unaffected when asked about Tara. He simply said she'd left him, an explanation that no one found credible. Tara was a devoted mother leaving her children without a word was unthinkable. Forensic analysis later revealed blood traces throughout the Edwards home, It was now clear that Tara had not simply walked out, she had been killed there, and her body removed in an effort to cover up the crime. Police then discovered the chilling detail that Edwards had called Tara's phone multiple times after her death. It was a deliberate attempt to stage a false narrative, to convince everyone around him that she had chosen to leave, but the facade was crumbling. His financial transactions told another part of the story. Edwards had been withdrawing large amounts of money, using Tara's accounts, and moving assets. These actions further confirmed that he had planned to obscure the truth, even if only to buy time. Then came a crucial tip. A friend of Edwards, increasingly disturbed by his emotionless behavior and contradictory statements, came forward. They told detectives about a conversation in which Edwards calmly claimed Tara had simply walked out on him again, something completely at odds with everything known about her. This tip led police to re-examine a remote creek area outside Melbourne where Tara's remains were ultimately found, though decomposed. Forensic evidence matched Tara's blood and clothing. Her body had been dumped in a shallow, overgrown spot, discarded in a last-ditch attempt to erase her existence. Edwards' efforts to hide his crime only revealed more of his guilt, his lies, his rehearsed behavior, his cold detachment. Everything pointed to a man who had long hidden behind a mask. In the end, that mask cracked. Tara's story stands as a haunting reminder of the silent suffering that often occurs within abusive relationships. It reminds us of the urgent need to listen, to intervene, and to protect those who may be in danger, long before tragedy strikes. With Tara's body discovered, the investigation entered its final phase. Christopher Edwards was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, sticking to his original story that Tara had simply left him, but his account was full of contradictions, and as detectives pressed him harder, the facade began to crumble. After hours of relentless interrogation, Edwards finally broke in a chilling, detached confession. He admitted to killing Tara. Following a heated argument, he described how his rage escalated beyond control, first striking her with a blunt object, then strangling her in a fit of jealous fury. He confessed to harboring deep resentment, feeling betrayed by Tara's refusal to obey his demands and live by his rules. It wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, it was premeditated. Edwards admitted he had planned her murder, taken steps to conceal the crime, and dumped her body in a nearby creek to make it appear as though she had vanished in the days that followed the murder. Edwards pretended to be a grieving husband. He called friends and family, feigned concern for Tara's whereabouts, and tried to buy himself time, but the truth had already begun to unravel. To those who knew Christopher Edwards, the confession was unthinkable. He had always come across as quiet, perhaps reserved, but certainly not violent. No one could reconcile the man they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer now before them. As investigators dug deeper into the couple's marriage, a darker picture emerged of a controlling, emotionally abusive man, and a woman who had tried and failed to escape. Tara had endured years of psychological torment. Her death was the tragic culmination of a relationship poisoned by manipulation and domination. Christopher Edwards, unable to control his insecurities and jealousy, never sought help. Instead, he allowed his rage to fester until it exploded into an irreversible act of violence for Tara's family. The grief was unimaginable. She had been a devoted mother, a loving daughter, and a kind friend. Her death left a permanent scar on everyone who knew her, especially her children, who would now grow up without the warmth, protection, and guidance of their mother. The case brought renewed attention to the hidden dangers of emotional abuse. Tara's story became a heartbreaking reminder of how abuse often thrives in silence, hidden behind closed doors and beneath carefully maintained appearances. Christopher Edwards had fooled everyone around him, but his mask eventually slipped. As the trial approached, the community braced itself for the disturbing details that would emerge. The courtroom was tense as Edwards took his seat, expressionless, unresponsive, almost eerily calm. Those who had once trusted him watched as prosecutors laid out a damning case. They showed how he meticulously planned Tara's murder, covered his tracks, and deceived everyone around him. Blood evidence in the house, misleading phone calls made after Tara's death, and financial moves designed to obscure his intentions all pointed to calculated guilt. The defense, in contrast, painted Edwards as a man on the edge, mentally unraveling after years of emotional strain. They argued he had snapped, consumed by grief and turmoil, not malice. His eventual confession, they said, was a sign of remorse, but even that wasn't enough to humanize him in the eyes of many throughout the proceedings. Edwards remained disturbingly detached. He rarely looked up, rarely reacted. Witnesses noted how cold he seemed, like a man disconnected from the devastation he had caused. Tara's family bravely took the stand. Her parents, friends, and loved ones described a woman full of warmth and strength, someone who had done everything she could to raise her children and build a life. Even in the face of constant adversity, her mother spoke through tears, remembering the last conversation she had with Tara. She recalled how Tara had expressed fear, how she had tried to leave Edwards multiple times, but was repeatedly manipulated into staying. The guilt of not being able to save her daughter was etched into every word. Although Tara's children were too young to testify, their absence spoke volumes. The loss they suffered was irreplaceable, a void that no sentence could ever fill. Edwards' own friends and relatives were left stunned. Many struggled to accept what he had done. Some said they had never seen any warning signs. Others admitted they now realized they had ignored troubling behaviors. The question remained, how could someone so seemingly normal commit such an unthinkable act? The prosecution insisted this was not a momentary lapse, but a deliberate, premeditated murder. Edwards had allowed his need for control and his seething jealousy to dictate his actions. Tara had tried to reclaim her independence, but Edwards couldn't accept it, so he silenced her forever. As closing arguments wrapped up, the jury faced a grim decision. Would they see Edwards as a man pushed to the brink, or as a manipulator who planned his wife's murder in cold blood? For Tara's family and friends, the outcome wouldn't bring her back, but they hoped that justice would at least give them the beginning of closure, and that Tara's story would stand as a warning of what can happen when emotional abuse is ignored, minimized, or hidden in plain sight. Christopher Edwards' trial painted a chilling picture of calculated malice. Prosecutors argued that this was no crime of passion, it was premeditated and deliberate. Edwards had gone to great lengths to avoid detection, and his complete lack of remorse or visible emotion in court only reinforced the claim that he acted out of cruelty, not desperation. The defense acknowledged his guilt, but urged the court to consider his fragile mental state at the time of the murder. They argued that Edwards had been emotionally compromised and had not fully understood the consequences of his actions. They pleaded for a lesser charge, manslaughter, instead of murder, pointing to his eventual confession as evidence of genuine remorse. After several weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached its decision. Christopher Edwards was found guilty of the murder of his wife, Tara Edwards. The court ruled that he had indeed planned the crime, motivated by jealousy and anger, with no regard for the life he was about to destroy. Tara's family, though devastated, finally exhaled. Justice had been served, but the verdict could never restore what they had lost in the weeks that followed. Edwards was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge condemned the brutality of the act and emphasized the importance of accountability, sending a clear message: domestic violence and murder will never be Tara's loved ones. The pain remained. They had fought to hold her killer accountable and succeeded, but the absence of her love, her laughter, and her guidance, especially for her children, left a void that would never be filled. The tragic story of Tara Edwards became a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind closed doors and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. Story 7, Europe in Crisis. 2015. In 2015, Europe was shaken to its core by a series of high-profile criminal and terrorist events, none more devastating than the coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris on November 13th. At night, a team of heavily armed ISIS operatives struck multiple targets across the city. Their first was the Stade de France, where suicide bombers detonated explosives during a soccer match simultaneously. Gunmen attacked packed restaurants and cafes, firing indiscriminately into crowds, but the deadliest scene unfolded at the Bataclan concert hall, where a rock band was performing there. Attackers took hostages and massacred dozens before French forces stormed the venue. By the time the night ended, 130 people had been killed, and hundreds more injured. It was one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in modern European history. The attackers, radicalized and trained by ISIS, had coordinated across multiple countries. The investigation revealed extensive planning and cross-border movements, highlighting critical weaknesses in Europe's counter-terrorism intelligence. In the aftermath, authorities arrested several individuals linked to the network, uncovering ties to operatives in Syria and Iraq. The Paris attacks triggered a sweeping overhaul of European security policy. Borders were tightened, surveillance expanded, intelligence sharing between nations became a top priority. But the attacks also sparked intense debate. How do societies balance safety with civil liberties? And how do nations combat extremism without compromising core democratic values? Just 3 months earlier, on August 21st, Europe narrowly avoided another massacre, this time aboard a high-speed Thalys train, en route from Amsterdam to Paris. A heavily armed man, later identified as Ayoub El-Kazani, boarded the train in Brussels, intent on mass murder, but his plans were thwarted by the quick, heroic actions of passengers, including 3 Americans, Spencer Stone, Alex Carlatos, and Anthony Sadler. They rushed the gunman, tackled him, and disarmed him before he could fire on the passengers. El-Kazani was arrested and later charged with terrorism-related offenses. Investigations showed he had spent months preparing, acquiring an assault rifle, a Luger pistol, and ammunition. His failed attack underscored the persistent threat posed by so-called lone wolf operatives and the challenges security agencies face in identifying and stopping them before they strike. The incident led to renewed discussions about security aboard public transportation and the vital role of citizen vigilance in preventing tragedy. Organized crime in Europe. The rising tide terrorism wasn't the only threat facing Europe in 2015, that same year. The continent also saw a sharp escalation in organized crime in the Netherlands, a country long known for its liberal drug laws. The surge in drug-related violence reached alarming levels. Rival drug cartels battled for dominance, leaving a trail of murders and public shootings. The violence grew so intense that Dutch authorities were forced to deploy additional police resources in key areas. The cartels weren't just dealing drugs, they were laundering money, extorting businesses, and intimidating communities. These groups expanded their influence beyond Dutch borders, operating across the EU. In response, the Netherlands tightened laws, boosted surveillance, and sought greater international cooperation to dismantle the powerful networks at the heart of the violence. The situation demonstrated the growing reach of transnational crime and the urgent need for unified European strategies to confront it. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, 2015 saw the conviction of several major figures tied to large-scale drug trafficking rings. The UK's National Crime Agency, NCA, reported a notable increase in drug-related arrests, reflecting the intensifying battle against organized crime. These convictions were the result of years-long investigations, many carried out in partnership with local and international law enforcement. The operations disrupted smuggling routes, shut down distribution hubs, and put key operatives behind bars. The success of these efforts highlighted the power of coordinated enforcement, but they also raised questions. Were current drug policies truly effective? And how could the UK reduce the demand and profitability that made drug crime so appealing? Across Europe, 2015 was a year of reckoning. From terrorist atrocities to the shadow wars of organized crime. The continent faced threats that tested its institutions, its people, and its resolve. In the wake of tragedy, nations began to rethink security, strengthen alliances, and confront the dangers hiding in plain sight. In 2015. Europe found itself confronting an increasingly complex web of criminal activity, from drug trafficking and mafia syndicates to terrorism and human exploitation. Authorities across the continent began to recognize a crucial truth: that no single solution could address the evolving landscape of crime. A multifaceted strategy was needed, one that prioritized prevention, treatment, enforcement, and international cooperation. Long plagued by powerful organized crime groups, achieved a landmark victory that year with the conviction of several key members of the Ndrangheta, one of Europe's most secretive and dominant criminal syndicates. The verdicts came after a lengthy investigation that exposed the group's vast operations, which included drug trafficking, extortion, and sophisticated money laundering schemes. But the Ndrangheta's reach extended far beyond Italy. They had cemented footholds in Germany, the Netherlands, and other parts of Europe, where they infiltrated both legal and illegal economies. The 2015 convictions were seen as a major blow to their operations, and a testament to the growing success of cross-border intelligence and law enforcement collaboration. Italy's efforts against the Ndrangheta were part of a broader national strategy to combat organized crime, bolstering law enforcement capabilities, refining the legal framework, and increasing public awareness about the threats posed by such syndicates. These convictions marked a pivotal moment in the country's battle against entrenched criminal power structures. But Italy wasn't alone. Across the continent, the year 2015 revealed a spectrum of security challenges, from organized drug rings to terrorism and human trafficking. These developments underscored the urgent need for enhanced security protocols, coordinated intelligence, and vigilant public engagement. Following the devastating Paris attacks, Europe was shaken into action. The European Union took bold steps to confront the rising tide of terrorism, and transnational crime intelligence and counter-terrorism agencies across the region intensified efforts to identify and neutralize extremist threats, leading to a series of coordinated operations targeting individuals and cells linked to ISEs within weeks. Authorities uncovered a vast terror network operating out of Brussels. It connected operatives in Belgium, France, and Syria. The persistent threat of foreign fighters and the difficulty of dismantling terror cells operating across international borders in Belgium. The Molenbeek district in Brussels came under intense scrutiny. The neighborhood had gained infamy as a breeding ground for radicalization and was home to several of the Paris attackers, including the Abdeslam brothers. Salah Abdeslam, one of the last surviving perpetrators of the Paris massacre, was captured in March 2016, just blocks away from where he had been hiding since the attack. His arrest was seen as a major breakthrough in the fight against ISIS-linked terrorism, as Belgium and its neighbors faced mounting criticism for failing to prevent the attacks. The broader European response grew more resolute. Governments implemented tougher counter-extremism strategies, expanded intelligence sharing, and imposed stricter border controls, measures aimed at stemming the flow of jihadist operatives across Europe's open borders. Meanwhile, organized crime was evolving in parallel. 2015 saw a disturbing rise in violence in areas where drug cartels and criminal syndicates were most active. Globalization and the expansion of international shipping had transformed the European drug market. Criminal organizations exploited these routes to smuggle narcotics in staggering volumes. Spain, a key entry point for Latin American cocaine and heroin, found itself under siege. In response, Spanish police launched Operation Tarzan, targeting a notorious Colombian cartel operating out of the country's ports. Years of surveillance culminated in the arrest of dozens of individuals tied to the network, revealing just how far-reaching the cartel's influence had become. Their operations extended well beyond Spain, with ties to drug rings in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. The Netherlands, the port of Rotterdam, Europe's largest seaport, was a focal point for smugglers. Criminal groups used the busy shipping hub to transport illicit drugs hidden in commercial freight. Violence surged as rival factions fought for control of distribution routes. Dutch authorities responded with enhanced surveillance technology and large-scale enforcement operations to monitor and intercept suspicious shipments. In real time, one of the more unusual criminal developments of 2015 came from northern Italy, where authorities dismantled the so-called Mafia del Tartufo, the truffle mafia. This group had been illegally harvesting and trafficking rare truffles highly prized in the world of gourmet cuisine. Their black market activities caused significant losses to legitimate truffle producers and extended beyond food crime, involving extortion, smuggling, and money laundering. A coordinated raid led to the arrest of key figures and exposed yet another front in the expanding face of organized crime. But it wasn't just drugs or black market goods that plagued Europe. In one of the most harrowing revelations of 2015, investigators uncovered a massive human trafficking ring spanning several Eastern and Western European nations. Thousands of men, women, and children were smuggled across borders, only to be exploited for forced labor, prostitution, and other forms of abuse. Many of the victims were refugees fleeing conflict in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan as the European migrant crisis reached its peak. Traffickers preyed on these vulnerable individuals, offering them false promises of safety and opportunity in exchange for extortionate fees only to trap them in cycles of exploitation. Upon arrival, the Balkans became a primary corridor for smuggling routes. Criminal networks used forged documents and covert paths to move people into the heart of the EU, often evading detection with alarming ease. The situation became even more urgent as the scale of the refugee crisis deepened. The chaos created the perfect cover for trafficking networks to expand their operations. European governments, along with agencies like Europol and Interpol, responded by launching targeted operations, reinforcing borders, and working to dismantle the networks behind the human trade. The convergence of these crisis terrorism, drug cartels, and human trafficking made 2015 a watershed year in Europe's fight against organized crime. These weren't isolated issues, they were deeply interconnected, feeding off one another and thriving in the gaps between policy, enforcement, and humanitarian need. As the continent grappled with these challenges, one thing became clear: Europe's security would depend on more than just police raids or tightened borders. It would require a sustained, united approach, one that tackled not just the crimes themselves, but the root causes that allowed them to flourish. In the aftermath of escalating threats in 2015, the European Union made a firm commitment to strengthen its cooperation with international partners, particularly those in the Middle East and Africa. The goal: to better manage the growing migration crisis and curb the exploitation of vulnerable populations by criminal networks. Despite the immense challenges that year, European law enforcement achieved some hard-won victories. The successful conviction of key members of the Mafia del Tartufo, along with major drug busts across several nations, stood as proof of Europe's unwavering resolve to combat organized crime. The fight against terrorism and transnational criminal enterprises was relentless, but 2015 marked a turning point. Cross-border alliances were forged, surveillance systems were enhanced, and intelligence sharing mechanisms were tightened for the first time in years. These efforts began yielding measurable results, yet the continent's problems extended far beyond organized crime and extremist threats. As Europe stood at the peak of a historic refugee crisis, political and social tensions reached boiling point. Countries such as Germany, Hungary, and Greece became flashpoints as waves of desperate refugees poured in, fleeing war, poverty, and persecution from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and beyond. While many citizens welcomed them with compassion, a growing backlash from far-right groups cast a long and divisive shadow. These nationalist groups, often linked to underground crime syndicates, saw opportunity in the chaos. They fueled anti-immigrant sentiment, staged violent protests, and used the crisis to recruit and radicalize. Their message of exclusion and fear found fertile ground among those already disillusioned by political instability. Across Europe scrambled to respond. Germany kept its borders relatively open, upholding its humanitarian commitments. In stark contrast, countries like Hungary erected fences, enforced aggressive entry restrictions, and turned away asylum seekers. The rift between East and West within the EU deepened solidarity, gave way to internal friction, straining the very foundation of the Union. Amid the turbulence, however, the EU also stepped up its efforts against organized crime and terrorism. One of the most significant moves was the creation of the European Counterterrorism Center, ECTC, an ambitious initiative under Europol designed to coordinate intelligence, joint operations, and rapid responses to threats. The ECTC quickly became a cornerstone of European security strategy, but even as authorities made progress, the threat landscape continued to evolve. The November 2015 Paris attacks, the attempted train massacre in Belgium, and the persistent specter of ISIS reminded everyone that Europe was still firmly in the crosshairs of international terror networks beyond the physical battleground. 2015 also saw a dramatic surge in cybercrime as digital technologies advanced. So too did the tactics of criminals, government systems, private corporations, and individual citizens were all targeted in increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. The dark web emerged as a central hub for illicit trade, facilitating everything from drug trafficking and weapons sales to human exploitation. Law enforcement agencies, including Europol, diverted more resources into cyber investigations, but the borderless nature of digital crime made it nearly impossible to contain. Financial crime was another growing concern. Money laundering operations became more intricate, aided by the rapid expansion of online financial services. Criminals obscured the origins of their wealth through shell corporations, fake charities, and complex offshore structures. The explosive revelations of the Panama Papers in 2015 sent shockwaves across the globe. The leaks exposed how the world's elite corporations, politicians, and billionaires used offshore havens to stash away billions, evade taxes, and conceal wealth. European governments were forced to act. New anti-money laundering directives were introduced to increase financial transparency and choke off the flow of illicit funds. Surveillance of transactions became more rigorous, and pressure mounted on financial institutions to clean up their practices. In the United Kingdom, several high-profile laundering scandals rocked public confidence. Major banks and legal firms were implicated in helping clients move illegal money. The revelations sparked national outrage and demands for stricter accountability across the financial sector. Law enforcement also faced the emergence of cyber-terrorism. Hackers aligned with extremist groups used the internet as a weapon, radicalizing followers, coordinating attacks, and disseminating propaganda across social media platforms. The anonymity of the digital world made it a fertile ground for recruiting lone actors and spreading extremist ideologies. Despite the overwhelming challenges, 2015 was not without moments of triumph. The arrest of Salah Abdeslam, a key suspect in the Paris terror attacks, marked a significant breakthrough in Europe's anti-terror operations. Drug cartels and organized crime rings were dismantled across several countries through coordinated international efforts. These successes reminded the world that while the challenges were formidable, European law enforcement agencies were rising to meet them. By the end of 2015, Europe had entered a new era, one where terrorism, organized crime, cyber threats, and financial corruption were deeply interconnected. Each issue fed into the next, requiring a comprehensive and unified approach to national and international security. The lessons of 2015 reshaped Europe's future as the continent moved into 2016. It did so with a sharper understanding of its vulnerabilities and a renewed determination to protect its people, its values, and its borders. Transition to Story 8 across the Atlantic. The United States was confronting its own set of hyper-criminal cases in 2015, cases that would reshape law enforcement practices and captivate the nation. One such case was the mysterious death of Robert Mitkin, a powerful real estate mogul with deep ties to New York's elite, found murdered in his Upper East Side penthouse. McKinn's death unleashed a media frenzy, and one of the most complex investigations of the year. What followed was a labyrinth of lies, betrayals, and secrets, one that would unravel slowly and publicly, drawing in a cast of suspects from the city's wealthiest circles. And at the heart of it all was a question no one could yet answer. Who killed Robert McKinnon? Why? From high-powered business partners to distant family members, Robert McKean had built a formidable empire in New York City's cutthroat real estate market, known for his charm and ambition. He mingled effortlessly with politicians, CEOs, and celebrities, frequently attending black-tie galas, hosting opulent soirees, and making front-page appearances in society magazines. His wealth extended far beyond property. McKean was a savvy investor, with stakes in booming tech startups and global ventures on the surface. His life was the very definition of success, but behind the polished exterior, McKean had a reputation for being ruthless, using manipulation, intimidation, and backdoor deals to dominate his competitors' rivals. Whispered of a man who would stop at nothing to win the night. Robert McKean died was unsettlingly quiet. His assistant, who typically spoke with him each evening, grew concerned when her calls went unanswered. Acting on instinct, she used her key to enter his luxury apartment. What she discovered was a scene straight out of a nightmare. McKean was found lying face down in a pool of blood. The upscale penthouse, decorated with priceless artwork and designer furnishings, was in disarray, as though a violent struggle had occurred. Early reports indicated he had been shot at close range, likely by someone he knew. This didn't look like a robbery gone wrong, it looked personal. Investigators immediately turned their attention to those closest to McKenna's inner circle of family members and business associates. The first to be questioned was his wife, Veronica McKean, a former fashion model. Veronica and Robert had long portrayed the image of a power couple, but behind closed doors, their marriage had been marred by scandal, public arguments, mutual accusations of infidelity, and a growing emotional distance. Veronica, now in her mid-40s, was initially cooperative, but her nervous demeanor and shifting stories quickly raised red flags. Detectives placed her under surveillance and began combing through her finances, looking for possible motives. At the same time, the investigation shifted focus to McKean's business dealings. Over the years, he'd made more than a few enemies in the high-stakes world of real estate. One name stood out: Mark Graves. Graves had once been McKean's trusted business partner, but after being pushed out of a lucrative joint venture, Graves had become a vocal critic, accusing McKean of dishonesty and claiming credit for projects they had once developed together. Just months before the murder, Graves had allegedly threatened to expose McKean's involvement in bribery and money laundering schemes. His anger was no secret. Many wondered, had that rage finally boiled over into something deadly? Another person of interest was Lisa Turner, McKean's young personal assistant. Smart, ambitious, and loyal, Turner had worked closely with McKean for several years. Sources suggested she had grown emotionally attached to him, and rumors circulated about a possible affair. Turner, however, denied any romantic involvement and told investigators she had been at home the night of the murder. But her alibi was flimsy at best. Detectives began to suspect she knew more than she was admitting. Then came a stunning revelation. Just weeks before his death, McKean had updated his will in the revised document. He left the bulk of his estate to a charitable foundation. He had founded an organization focused on supporting underprivileged children. Strikingly, Veronica was cut out of the will entirely. In his previous will, she had been the primary beneficiary. This drastic change raised serious questions. Had Veronica discovered she'd been written out and acted out of desperation? Investigators began digging into her financial records and discovered a web of gambling debts and shady investments. Her glamorous lifestyle masked a mounting pile of liabilities. Meanwhile, suspicion around Graves remained strong. He had every reason to want McKean gone, yet his alibi checked out on the night of the murder. He had been working late at his office. Phone records, security footage, and business calls all confirmed it. His fingerprints weren't found at the scene, and there was no forced entry if he was involved, detectives theorized. He may have hired someone to do the job. Lisa Turner remained a compelling figure in the investigation. She had been one of the last people to see McKean alive, and her access to his personal life was unmatched still. No hard evidence tied her to the crime as the case unfolded. Detectives found themselves entangled in a complex web of secrets, ambition, and betrayal. Robert McKean had thrived in a world where power often outweighed principles. His empire had been built through cutthroat deals, broken alliances, and questionable morals. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became this wasn't just a murder, it was the unraveling of a life built on manipulation and control. Behind the lavish lifestyle and public persona lay a much darker reality, one where loyalty was fleeting and trust came at a price. The investigation continued for weeks, with new leads surfacing and old suspicions reigniting, yet no single suspect could be definitively linked to the crime in the end. The murder of Robert McKean would come to symbolize more than personal tragedy, reflected the brutal undercurrent of greed and ambition that often fuels the world of the elite. Turner claimed she had been at home with her fiancé on the night of the murder, but no one could independently verify her whereabouts on the surface. Her relationship with Robert McKean had always appeared professional, but whispers among colleagues suggested Turner may have played a more personal role in his life than anyone realized. Just weeks before the murder, Turner had asked McKean for a significant raise on appeal. He denied. The rejection caused visible tension between them. Some believed the raise was about more than money, that it stemmed from a deeper personal frustration. Others speculated Turner had developed romantic feelings for McKean, feelings that went unreciprocated. Her emotional outbursts during her police interview only lent credence to that theory. Detectives soon turned their attention to Turner's financial activity. They uncovered a series of unusual transactions, small but frequent deposits into her bank account. Initially, these were assumed to be related to personal debts or relationships, but further investigation revealed that some funds came from offshore accounts. In immediate red flag, Turner had also been spending lavishly, purchasing jewelry, designer clothes, and other high-end items, well beyond her apparent means. When questioned, she insisted the money came from her fiancé's gifts, yet no such transactions appeared in his financial records. Investigators began to suspect her motives could be both emotional and financial. If McKean had blocked her advancement professionally and possibly rejected her personally, Turner might have seen eliminating him as a way to reclaim control and secure her future. Still, without concrete evidence linking her to the crime scene, the case against her remained circumstantial. As the investigation unfolded, attention shifted to Veronica McKean, Robert's wife. While it was no secret that their marriage had been troubled for years, investigators were surprised to learn that Robert had recently amended his will, cutting Veronica out entirely. This sudden legal change, made just weeks before his death, pointed to a possible motive rooted in financial desperation. Veronica had a well-documented history of gambling, and her mounting debts had placed enormous strain on the marriage. According to close friends, Robert had threatened to file for divorce if she didn't seek treatment for her addiction, a demand she had refused. In the days leading up to the murder, Veronica had been spotted at several upscale casinos, and her bank statements revealed alarming losses. Her alibi, she had been at a friend's house during the time of the murder, could not be corroborated. Perhaps even more suspicious was her demeanor when detectives questioned her. Veronica appeared detached, showing little to no emotion about her husband's death. Colleagues later echoed this observation, noting that she exhibited no visible signs of grief. Adding to this suspicion, police learned that Veronica had recently met with an attorney. According to the lawyer, she had been inquiring about divorce proceedings and asking how she might still claim a substantial portion of Robert's estate, despite knowing she'd been removed from the will. To detectives, this painted a portrait of a woman who may have been driven by greed and fear of losing her financial lifeline. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded critical insights. The murder weapon was a rare firearm traced back to a local gun store. Records showed it had been purchased just weeks earlier by an unregistered buyer. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings captured a hooded figure entering Robert McKean's apartment around the time of the murder, although the individual's face was obscured. They were seen exiting the building shortly after the shooting. The breakthrough came when forensic teams found traces of a rare type of gunpowder residue on Lisa Turner's clothing. This discovery, though not definitive, strongly suggested proximity to the firearm used, but the most startling development came from Robert McKean's own phone records on the night of his murder. He made several calls to a number linked to Victor Choi, a notorious underworld figure in New York's criminal circles. Choi was known for his involvement in loan sharking, money laundering, and a vast illegal gambling network. His name was whispered with fear throughout the city. McKean's connection to Choi had been deeply buried on the surface. They shared legitimate business interests, but behind the scenes, their dealings were far murkier. Investigators discovered that the two men had recently been involved in a high-stakes real estate investment. McKean, it seemed, had tried to edge Choi out of the deal, a betrayal that likely didn't sit well with the crime boss. What became clear was that McKean had grown increasingly uneasy with his criminal entanglements. He had begun making overtures to sever ties with Choi, reaching out to several of Choi's associates in a desperate bid to extract himself from the underworld while preserving his business empire. One particular wire transfer stood out. A large sum sent from McKinney's account to one of Choi's known shell companies. The transfer appeared to be about McKinney's final attempt to end their business relationship amicably, but it was too little. Too late. Detectives uncovered that McKean had arranged a meeting with Choi on the very night he was killed, hoping to settle matters in person. The meeting was to take place in his penthouse apartment, but Choi never showed. Instead, evidence suggested he had sent one of his trusted enforcers, someone tasked not with negotiation, but with finality. Hitman known only in the underworld as Ivan the Hammer Petrov had been dispatched with a singular, brutal mission: ensure that Robert McKean would never walk away from the deal. Petrov, a Russian national with a long and violent criminal history, was notorious for carrying out executions with ruthless precision. His reputation for leaving no trace made him one of the most feared contract killers in the business. On that fateful night, Petrov entered McKean's apartment, posing as a business associate. Evidence from the crime scene later revealed that McKean had tried to fight back. Petrov was prepared, skilled, and deadly. The struggle between the two men had been fierce, but in the end, McKean was overpowered. A single gunshot, fired at point-blank range, ended his life. The trajectory of the bullet suggested McKean hadn't seen it coming. Petrov left the scene quickly and efficiently, erasing every trace of his presence. Mere minutes later, McKean's assistant arrived at the apartment only to discover the grisly aftermath. The revelation that Ivan Petrov was behind the murder marked a major turning point in the investigation. But it was far from over. Law enforcement now faced the daunting task of tracking down Petrov, who had vanished into a vast criminal network that extended from New York to the furthest reaches of Europe. Victor Choi, the businessman tied to McKean's dealings, had also gone underground, likely fearing that his role in orchestrating the murder would soon come to light. With both men on the run, investigators were left to piece together an international conspiracy without their prime suspects. As the manhunt intensified, law enforcement agencies began coordinating with international partners. Intelligence soon revealed that Choi had likely fled to Asia, hiding in either Hong Kong or Macau, places where he maintained discreet safe houses. Petrov, meanwhile, had reportedly been spotted somewhere in Europe, though his precise location remained elusive. The murder of Robert McKean was no longer just a local homicide. It had become a case that exposed the dark web connecting global business elites and organized crime. Meanwhile, suspicions surrounding Robert's wife, Veronica McKean, continued to linger. Her financial records raised red flags. and her detached reaction to Robert's death made investigators uneasy. While she was never accused of pulling the trigger, the prosecution eventually concluded that her motivations rooted in greed and desperation had made her complicit. Veronica was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and received a multi-year prison sentence, but the primary focus remained on Choi and Petrov, the architects of the killing. Months later, the international manhunt reached a critical turning point when Victor Choi was captured in Hong Kong. Petrov, however, remained at large. Choi, hoping for a reduced sentence, began to talk in a full confession. He admitted to orchestrating the murder, providing investigators with key information that finally unraveled the entire plot. Still, Ivan Petrov, the man who pulled the trigger, remains a fugitive to this day. The brutal slaying of Robert McKean sent shockwaves through the financial world. It exposed a dangerous intersection of legitimate business and international crime syndicates. The case became a chilling reminder of how ambition, betrayal, and greed could leave even the most powerful vulnerably. In South Dakota, July 18, 2015. The peaceful town was jolted awake by a nightmare. 18-year-old Emily Anderson had vanished without a trace. She had left home that morning, headed to her best friend Megan's house just a few blocks away. It was something she did every Saturday, an ordinary part of her routine. But that afternoon, Megan's mother called Emily's mom, Sarah Anderson, asking why Emily hadn't arrived. Panic set in. Immediately, Sarah and her husband, David, began calling neighbors and friends, hoping someone had seen her, but no one had. Sarah contacted the police, and within hours, a community-wide search was underway. Volunteers canvassed the neighborhood. Police reviewed security footage from nearby businesses, hoping to catch a glimpse of Emily's path. Soon, they found something. A nearby convenience store's camera captured a dark-colored van slowing as it approached Emily on the sidewalk. The footage showed a man wearing a hooded sweatshirt, leaning out of the passenger window, speaking to her briefly. Moments later, Emily walked out of the frame. The van lingered a while longer before speeding off in the opposite direction, though the video was too grainy to capture the suspect's face. Investigators were convinced this wasn't a random encounter. This was a planned abduction. Veteran detective Brian Carter took over the case. His immediate decision: issue an Amber Alert. Word spread quickly. Local schools were notified. Media outlets reported Emily's disappearance, and flyers went up across town. Then, just after 2 a.m., the Andersons received a call. Sarah answered, her hands trembling. On the other end of the line was a deep, gravelly voice, calm but threatening. The caller claimed to have Emily. He demanded a ransom, warning that if police got involved again, Emily would be harmed. Then he hung up. The call had been made from a disposable phone, leaving no way to trace its origin. The FBI joined the investigation, lending their expertise to the frantic search, but each new call from the abductor led nowhere. Burner phones, dead ends, and no trace of Emily's whereabouts. It became clear this was no amateur. The man knew what he was doing, and with each passing day, the Andersons' hope began to dwindle. David hired a private investigator. Sarah worked closely with the FBI, desperately trying to do something. The case gained national attention. The community rallied. But weeks passed and still no Emily. Detective Carter and his team refused to give up. They reviewed the convenience store footage again and again. Then, finally, a man matching the van driver's description was spotted on another camera near the gas station just a few blocks from where Emily vanished. Emily appeared to willingly get into the van just moments before it sped away. The man behind the wheel had been wearing a baseball cap and dark clothing, his face partially obscured, but it was just enough for investigators to start narrowing in on a suspect through a combination of witness statements and cross-referencing vehicle registrations in the area. Detectives eventually identified the man seen in the surveillance footage. 38-year-old Thomas Hayes had a prior criminal record, mostly consisting of assault charges, but there was no documented history of child abduction. Still, something about his recent behavior raised alarm bells when detectives pulled his phone records. They found that Hayes had been in contact with the same disposable phones used to call the Anderson family. Detective Brian Carter learned that Hayes had recently been evicted from a small apartment in a rural town several hours outside Aberdeen. Reportedly due to an undisclosed legal dispute, authorities moved quickly, tracking Hayes through his known addresses and speaking with his former neighbors. After several tense days, law enforcement located his vehicle abandoned and partially concealed outside a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Card team was brought in to assist, and together with local police, they executed a tactical raid on the property inside. The house was eerily silent. Officers quickly swept through the upper floors before finding the basement door locked from the outside. They broke it down and there, in a small windowless room, they found Emily Shear was bound to a chair but physically unharmed still. She was in a state of deep shock, her eyes wide, her voice barely a whisper. It was clear the trauma of her ordeal had left invisible scars. Emily was rushed to a nearby hospital for immediate evaluation, and Thomas Hayes was arrested on site and charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple counts of assault. During questioning, Hayes confessed to abducting Emily, but his explanation only deepened the mystery. He claimed he hadn't acted alone. According to Hayes, he'd been following the orders of a mysterious figure who had promised him a large sum of money in return for carrying out the abduction. He refused to name the individual or offer any other details. Detective Carter wasn't convinced this was just the work of one man. Something about Hayes's calm demeanor during the interrogation felt off, too composed, too calculated, and despite the confession, Hayes remained vague and evasive. When pressed for more information, was he protecting someone? Was he being manipulated? Or was this mysterious accomplice merely a figment of his imagination? Hayes's background offered few clues on paper. He wasn't someone you'd expect to be capable of a calculated kidnapping. His criminal record was relatively minor, some petty theft, a few low-level assault charges, but nothing that would have suggested he'd take part in something so premeditated and disturbing. Those who knew him described him as a loner, someone who kept to himself. He didn't have close friends. Neighbors said he was reclusive, but not threatening, just udaz. The investigation continued. It became clear there was more to this case than anyone had initially suspected. Detective Carter began combing through Hayes's past, looking for any thread thought might connect him to a larger operation or a second party involved in Emily's disappearance. What he found only added to the mystery. Hayes had been living in near poverty before the abduction. He'd bounced between jobs and was recently evicted with nowhere to go. His financial desperation might have made him an easy target, someone vulnerable enough to be manipulated into doing someone else's dirty work. Still, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes was holding back, either out of fear or allegiance. The detective now faced two pressing questions. Who was the shadowy figure Hayes claimed to be working for? And was this just the beginning of something much darker? Though Emily was safe, the case was far from over. The town of Aberdeen had been forever changed. Once a peaceful, tight-knit community, it now found itself haunted by the reality that a predator had been hiding in plain sight, and perhaps still was, for the Anderson family. The relief of being reunited with their daughter was tempered by the long road ahead. Emily would need time, therapy, and space to begin healing. The scars of what had happened wouldn't vanish overnight, and somewhere, perhaps still watching from the shadows, the person who orchestrated her abduction had yet to be found. Just a month before the abduction, Thomas Hayes had been evicted from his apartment. Sinking deeper into financial hardship, there was an air of desperation about him, but that alone didn't explain why he had chosen to abduct Emily Anderson, a seemingly random child from a quiet suburban neighborhood. Detective Carter needed answers, and to find them, he would have to dig further into Hayes's life. After hours of intense interrogation, Hayes finally broke down. His voice trembled as he began to reveal the series of events that led to Emily's kidnapping. The story he told was difficult to believe at first. According to Hayes, He had been approached by a man named Michael Walsh, someone from his past who had resurfaced unexpectedly. Walsh was no stranger to shady dealings, and Hayes remembered him as a manipulative figure who thrived on pulling strings. Behind the scenes, Walsh had tracked Hayes down and offered him a deal, help with a job, and in return, he would be paid enough to change his life. That job was the abduction of Emily Anderson. Hayes claimed Walsh had selected Emily because her parents were wealthy and would be willing to pay a ransom. Walsh promised that once the money came through, they'd split it and walk away rich at first. Hayes resisted. He didn't want to risk going back to prison, but as the pressure mounted and the promise of a new beginning dangled in front of him, he gave in. Hayes described how he had followed Emily for several days, learning her routine when she left her house, when she returned, and the route she took eventually. He concluded she was the perfect target. Walsh had laid out every detail of the plan, even providing the van Hayes would use and the disposable phone for contacting the Andersons. And the morning of July 18th, Hayes executed the plan. He pulled the van alongside Emily, telling her her parents had asked him to pick her up, trusting and unsuspecting. She climbed in. It wasn't until she was seated in the van that Hayes realized the full weight of what he had done. He drove her to the abandoned house Walsh had chosen, locking her in the basement. Though Hayes claimed he never intended to harm her, the situation quickly spiraled under Walsh's instruction. He called the Andersons and demanded a ransom. Detective Carter could see the guilt etched into Hayes's face as he recounted the story, but guilt didn't excuse the fact that he had made a choice. He had actively participated in the abduction of a child. Still, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. If Hayes had been following Walsh's orders, then who exactly was Michael Walsh, and where was he now? Leaving the interrogation room that night, Carter felt the weight of a deeper mystery pressing down on him. Hayes's confession had unlocked a door, but behind it was an even darker truth. Finding Michael Walsh was now the key to uncovering the full scope of the crime. But Walsh had vanished without a trace. Detective Carter and his team ramped up their efforts to locate Walsh. Now the central figure in the investigation, the urgency was growing. Walsh wasn't just a mastermind behind one abduction. There was a real possibility he could strike again. Background checks on Walsh revealed surprisingly little at first. Hayes had described him vaguely, an old acquaintance who had gone underground years ago, but Carter had a gut feeling. Walsh wasn't just another career criminal. Something about him felt more dangerous, more calculated. Carter began exploring Walsh's potential ties to organized crime as investigators dug deeper. That theory started to gain traction. Walsh had spent time in multiple states, often popping up in areas known for criminal activity. He had a documented history of scams, blackmail, and ties to illegal gambling, but there was one recurring theme. Walsh was a manipulator, a man who didn't get his hands dirty himself, but convinced others to do it for him. It became increasingly clear that Hayes wasn't Walsh's first pawn, nor would he be the last. Walsh had a talent for identifying vulnerable people and exploiting them for his own ends. As Carter's team reviewed past cases, they started to notice patterns: other kidnappings, other shady operations, events that bore Walsh's invisible signature. It was as if he had been refining his technique, building toward something bigger, and now he had vanished. Federal agencies were brought in, alerts were issued across multiple states. Investigators followed every possible lead, hoping someone had seen something, anything that might point to Walsh's whereabouts. Still, he remained elusive. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Carter knew time was running out. The longer Walsh remained at large, the greater the risk, not just to Emily's family, but to others who might be targeted next. 2 weeks passed without a trace of Walsh. Each passing day made the case colder, but Carter refused to let it slip away. Molly's return and the elusive fugitive. It began with a phone call, anonymous, unexpected, and chilling. Someone had tipped off the local police station, claiming to know where Michael Walsh was hiding. The caller, who identified himself only as an old acquaintance of Walsh, provided a specific location: a remote house in rural Nebraska. just over the state line. He hadn't spoken directly to Walsh, but said he'd seen him in the area recently. What he overheard was even more unsettling, a conversation about a bag of money and vague hints of another job in the works, though details were sparse. The tone of the call was urgent. Detective Carter wasn't one to jump at shadows given how long Walsh had managed to stay hidden. It was hard to believe he'd be so careless as to linger in one place still. The lead was too specific to ignore. With support from the FBI, Carter and his team began planning the operation. They moved swiftly, but carefully, hoping to catch Walsh off guard in the early morning hours before dawn. They arrived at the Nebraska house. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the highway. The house appeared deserted, but Carter wasn't ready to call it off. He gave the order. The team breached the front door, weapons drawn. Officers swept through the house, clearing each room. It didn't take long to confirm what Carter feared. Walsh was gone, but he had been there. The kitchen counter held dirty dishes. Clothes were scattered across the floor, and a still warm cup of coffee sat on the table. They had missed him by hours. Maybe less frustration boiled beneath the surface. Once again, Walsh had slipped through their fingers, staying one step ahead. The case, already fraught with delays and setbacks, now felt like a cruel game of cat and mouse. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that Walsh was watching, waiting, and always anticipating their next move. Days turned into weeks despite tireless efforts. Walsh remained a ghost, yet Carter wasn't giving up. He doubled down. More manpower, more surveillance, more outreach. The search expanded across state lines, and international media news outlets picked up the story. And soon the entire country was watching. Emily Anderson, though safe, struggled to move on. Physically she was recovering, but emotionally, the trauma lingered. Nightmares, anxiety, fear of being alone. Her childhood had been scarred. Her parents lived in constant fear, knowing the man responsible for their daughter's pain was still out there, free, and possibly plotting his next crime. The investigation pressed on. Carter's team re-examined every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and followed even the faintest leads. They weren't just hunting for justice, they were trying to prevent another tragedy. Then, nearly 6 months after Emily's abduction, another anonymous tip came in. This time, the caller claimed Walsh had been seen at a secluded mountain cabin in Colorado. Carter didn't hesitate this time. The team was prepared for anything. They moved quickly, knowing there would be no second chances. Carter could feel it. This was the moment. This was the time Walsh's luck would finally run out. Case 10. The murder of Maria Santos in 2015. A chilling murder case sent shockwaves through the city of Manila, Philippines. The victim, 28-year-old Maria Santos, was a beloved figure in her community, young nurse with a bright future and a reputation for kindness and dedication. Her sudden and violent death left everyone in disbelief. Happened on a quiet November evening. Neighbors noticed something strange. Maria's apartment door had been left ajar. For someone as meticulous and safety-conscious as Maria, this was deeply out of character. Concerned, they entered the apartment. What they found was horrifying. Maria's lifeless body lay on the living room floor, a pool of blood soaking into the carpet. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned, broken objects scattered across the floor. There had clearly been a struggle. Maria had fought back. Her phone was missing, but there were no signs of forced entry. This led investigators to suspect the killer was someone she knew, someone she had let inside willingly. Veteran detective Ernesto Reyes, known for handling high-profile and emotionally complex cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. From the moment he stepped into the crime scene, something felt off. Despite the chaos, there was a haunting calm in the air, an eerie stillness that clung to the space. Reyes didn't believe this was a random act of violence. There were no signs of robbery. Her belongings were left untouched. This crime felt personal. As Reyes and his team dove into Maria's life, they learned she had recently ended a long-term relationship with Rafael Torres, a charismatic businessman in his early 30s. While on the surface, Rafael appeared charming and successful, those close to Maria painted a darker picture. Their relationship had become increasingly toxic in the final months. Friends described Raphael as possessive and emotionally abusive. He would frequently show up unannounced at Maria's apartment, accuse her of cheating, and demand to know where she had been. Maria had confided in several close friends about her growing fear of him. Worse still, rumors had begun to circulate that Maria was seeing someone new, a development that likely infuriated Raphael even more. With this information, Reyes quickly identified Raphael as a primary suspect. He was brought in for questioning, calm, cold, detached. That's how Raphael came across during the interrogation. He denied everything, claimed he hadn't seen Maria in weeks, and knew nothing of her death, but his demeanor only deepened Reyes's suspicions. It was as if Raphael had rehearsed every word, every expression, yet, for all their certainty, there was still no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no murder weapon. Still, Reyes knew this case wasn't about luck or guesswork. It was about truth, and the truth, as elusive as it seemed, was starting to take shape. He claimed he had been at a business meeting at the time of Maria's murder, and his alibi was corroborated by several colleagues. But Detective Reyes wasn't convinced. The more he questioned Rafael Torres, the more he noticed subtle inconsistencies in his story. His composure seemed rehearsed, his calm demeanor too controlled. Beneath the surface, Reyes sensed a quiet defensiveness, an indication that Rafael might be hiding something still. Reyes knew better than to base conclusions on instinct alone. He decided to dig deeper into Rafael's relationship with Maria, hoping to uncover something more concrete. A forensic sweep of Maria's apartment and personal belongings was ordered, and soon, investigators found a small but crucial piece of evidence: Rafael's fingerprints on the handle of Maria's front door. While not damning on its own, it was enough to warrant further scrutiny. Then came a major break: Maria's phone, though missing from the crime scene. Phone company records showed it had been used on the night of the murder. The last known location was near Raphael's office, placing him potentially close to the scene around the time of her death. When confronted with this information, Raphael's facade cracked for the first time. He appeared rattled, but just as quickly, he regained his composure and claimed someone must have stolen Maria's phone. Reyes decided it was time to shift focus. Instead of looking solely at Raphael, he began examining the broader context of Maria's life. He spoke with her colleagues and retraced her daily routine. That's when a new lead emerged, one that would reshape the investigation entirely. Just days before her death, Maria had been involved in organizing a high-profile hospital charity event. It had garnered local media attention, and Maria had been praised for her leadership and dedication. But the event had also brought her into close contact with a powerful donor. Carlos Delgado was a wealthy businessman with deep ties to the healthcare industry. He had made significant contributions to the charity and had been seen with Maria on multiple occasions. Staff members at the hospital whispered about their closeness. Some suggested the relationship might have crossed into romantic territory. With this new information, Detective Reyes arranged to interview Delgado. He appeared deeply saddened by Maria's death and was cooperative during questioning, but something about his demeanor felt off. He downplayed the depth of his relationship with Maria, insisting they had merely been friends. Reyes wasn't convinced, driven by a growing suspicion. Reyes returned to the charity event to interview organizers and volunteers. Maria had been universally admired, described as kind, committed, and generous with her time. Yet several people noted a change in her demeanor. In the days before her death, she had grown more withdrawn, distracted, clearly burdened by something she hadn't shared with those around Hera. Few volunteers hinted at tension between Maria and Delgado. Although no one had witnessed the confrontation directly, it was clear their dynamic had shifted. Something had happened, something private and possibly volatile. Reyes's suspicions were confirmed when investigators uncovered a series of calls and messages exchanged between Maria and Delgado on the night she died. But then, a critical gap. Maria's phone went silent for a stretch of time that aligned with her estimated time of death. It suggested something significant had occurred, something neither man had been honest about now. The question was no longer just about Rafael Torres. Was Carlos Delgado merely a grieving acquaintance, or had his relationship with Maria taken a darker turn? And if Rafael, with his possessive nature, had discovered that connection, what might he have done in response? As Reyes prepared for a second, more focused interview with Delgado, he knew the investigation was entering its most delicate phase. The truth was buried beneath a web of emotion, power, jealousy, and secret sand. Untangling it would take persistence, precision, and a willingness to follow the case. Wherever it led, Carlos Delgado arrived at the police station with a calm, composed demeanor. His tailored suit and polished appearance stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. He expressed sincere distress over Maria's death, but as Detective Reyes observed, Delgado's responses seemed to deliberate, measured, as though rehearsed in advance. He insisted that his relationship with Maria had been strictly professional, denying any romantic involvement, yet something about his tight control, his reluctance to elaborate on their final interactions, stirred unease in Reyes. It was subtle, but telling. Reyes pressed harder, focusing on the evening Maria was killed. Delgado claimed he had been at a business dinner, and his alibi initially appeared to hold up, but when Reyes compared this statement to earlier interviews, a discrepancy emerged. Delgado had previously said he last saw Maria at the charity event 2 days before her murder. Now, he stated, they had spoken later that same evening, just hours before she was killed. Caught off guard by this inconsistency, Delgado hesitated. It was the first real crack in his polished facade. Reyes noticed another troubling detail. Delgado seemed unusually preoccupied with the specifics of the murder. He asked questions that were far too precise, details that hadn't been made public to Reyes. It felt like Delgado was fishing for information, not simply grieving. The more Reyes examined Delgado's behavior, the stronger his suspicion grew. With probable cause now taking shape, he authorized a full search of Delgado's home and office, hoping to uncover a deeper connection to Maria's murder. What the investigators found painted a darker portrait than anyone expected. Delgado's public image was that of a refined and respectable businessman, but whispers in the business community told a different story. There were rumors of a short temper and controlling tendencies, particularly with women who turned down his advances. Most had dismissed them as gossip until noon. Delgado's office. Police recovered a personal journal believed to be his. Its contents were deeply unsettling, the entries cryptic, obsessive, and increasingly volatile, centered around Maria. Page after page revealed jealousy, resentment, and a possessive longing, though Maria had made efforts to keep their relationship professional. The journal hinted that Delgado viewed her as something more, something he believed he had. A right tune entry stood out in particular. I will make her see that no one else will love her the way I do. No one else can protect her like I can on its own. The phrase might have seemed like the ramblings of a heartbroken man, but in light of Maria's murder, it sounded far more sinister. Detective Reyes presented the journal to the district attorney as part of an emerging case against Delgado. Though circumstantial, the evidence established motive, obsession, and a dangerous emotional instability. Reyes hadn't ruled out Rafael Torres entirely, but all signs now pointed toward Delgado, the man with the most to lose: his ego, his control, his carefully curated public image. The more Reyes thought about it, the clearer it became. Maria had been caught in the crossfire between two men, one driven by jealousy, the other by obsession, and it had cost her everything. But Reyes also knew the investigation was far from over. The journal alone wasn't enough. He needed solid, irrefutable proof, something that would hold up in court. As his team examined the forensic evidence again, they focused on key crime scene details, blood spatter patterns, signs of a struggle, and the position of Maria's body. It was clear that she had fought for her life, but something was missing there. were no defensive wounds on her hands, no cuts, no bruises, no broken nails. It was as if Maria hadn't even tried to defend herself. This detail haunted Reyes. It suggested that Maria had been caught completely off guard, perhaps by someone she trusted. That possibility led Reyes to re-examine the building's security footage. He had reviewed the tapes before, but this time, he focused on one critical detail: the timestamp of the last known activity from Maria's phone. It had gone dark shortly after 9:40 p.m., a window that now aligned perfectly with Delgado's changing story. He was getting closer. The truth was beginning to surface, buried beneath layers of deception, control, and suppressed obsession. Delgado had built his entire life on maintaining power over his image, his empire, and the people around him. Maria, in refusing to submit to that control, had unknowingly become his greatest threat and possibly his final victim. But Reyes wasn't done. He vowed to follow every lead, uncover every lie, and bring justice, not just for Maria, but for all the others who may have been silenced before Herbie. Because this case wasn't just about a murder, it was about entitlement, manipulation, and the darkness that can grow behind even the most polished of mask surveillance. Footage revealed what Detective Reyes had long suspected. Carlos Delgado had been at Maria's apartment complex on the night she was murdered. The timestamp on the footage matched precisely with the last activity from Maria's phone. Though the footage was grainy, it was enough to confirm Delgado's presence in the parking garage at the critical time. With this new evidence, Reyes knew the noose was tightening. Delgado was brought in for another round of questioning. This time, the detective came armed with the damning footage and Delgado's own journal. From the moment Delgado sat down, his demeanor had changed. Gone was the confident, composed businessman from the earlier interrogations. He now appeared anxious, defensive, and visibly unsettled when confronted with the security footage. Delgado's eyes darted nervously toward the door just for a moment, but long enough for Reyes to catch it. The mask was beginning to crack. Reyes didn't let up. He opened Delgado's journal and began reading some of the darker entries aloud. As the words filled the room, Delgado's complexion paled, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His polished exterior unraveled further with every passing second. "You don't understand," Delgado finally said, his voice low and trembling. "She didn't love me the way I loved her. She didn't want me, but I did everything for her. I gave her everything." His voice wavered between anguish and anger. It was clear to Reyes that Delgado was not grieving a lost love. He was unraveling under the weight of obsession. The lines between love and control, admiration and ownership, had completely blurred. In Delgado's mind, Reyes leaned forward and asked the question directly. "Did you kill Maria Santos?" Delgado was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the floor. Then, almost in a whisper, as though defeated by the truth, he looked up and said, "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to see how much I cared. I didn't want anyone else to have her. I thought if she just understood we could be together. But when she pushed me away again, I lost control. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, though not a direct admission. It was all Reyes needed." Delgado had placed himself at the scene and admitted to the emotional motive that led to Maria's death. His confession sealed the case. Carlos Delgado was arrested for the murder of Maria Santos. The investigation had exposed the dangerous side of obsession, the fatal delusion that love can be forced, controlled, or owned. Delgado had not loved Maria. He had sought to possess her, and when he couldn't, he chose to destroy what he couldn't have. As Reyes watched Delgado being led away in handcuffs, he reflected on the painful arc of the case. Maria's story had become a stark reminder of how easily admiration can mutate into fixation, and how unchecked desire, when left to fester in the shadows, can end in tragedy. Months later, the trial of Carlos Delgado began. The prosecution presented a compelling case: the obsessive journal entries, the damning surveillance footage, and his emotional confession. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Delgado was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison for Maria's family. The verdict brought a measure of justice, but it did little to ease the pain of her loss. Maria had been a young woman full of promise, a compassionate nurse, a devoted daughter, and a beloved friend. Her life had been stolen by a man who mistook control for affection for Detective Reyes. The case left a lasting impression. It underscored the fragility of human emotion and the danger of mistaking obsession for love in the end. Justice had been served, but the emotional wounds left behind by Maria's death would linger in the hearts of those who loved her long after the trial ended.